Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from and what time is it there? Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The lighthouse keeper's secret. The lighthouse had been dark for exactly 13 years when Sarah Mitchell arrived on that fog-shrouded October evening, unaware that some lights should never be rekindled. The coastal town of Ravens Hollow had long whispered about the old keeper who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a logbook filled with increasingly frantic entries about shadows that moved against the light. But Sarah, a marine biologist seeking solitude to complete her research, dismissed such tales as small-town superstition. The property management company had been eager to rent the keeper's cottage at a fraction of its value. And Sarah, still reeling from a painful divorce, saw it as the perfect refuge. "You'll love the peace and quiet," the agent had assured her, with a nervous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, though most folks preferred to leave before sunset. Sarah had laughed it off then, but as she stood at the base of the towering structure, her luggage scattered around her feet, she felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the Atlantic wind. The cottage itself was charming in a weathered, nautical way, with blue shutters and a wraparound porch that faced the endless gray ocean, but it was the lighthouse that dominated the landscape, its white and red striped exterior feeling like old skin. Inside the cottage, Sarah found everything as promised, fully furnished, clean, with modern amenities discreetly integrated into the century-old structure. Yet, something felt off, like a piano slightly out of tune. Ain't that first night, as she unpacked her research materials and set up her laptop, she heard it, a rhythmic tapping from somewhere above, like Morse code against glass. Just the wind, she told herself, though the air outside had grown eerily still. Her cat, Schrodinger, normally curious about new environments, remained huddled in his carrier, eyes wide and ears flat against his head. The tapping continued, 3 short, 3 long. Soars, over and over, until Sarah grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. The lighthouse door, which the agent had explicitly told her would be locked and off-limits, stood slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges like an invitation. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the fog that had rolled in thick as wool. No answer came, but the tapping stopped, replaced by what sounded like footsteps ascending the spiral staircase. Inside, against every horror movie instinct she'd ever mocked, Sarah pushed open the door and stepped inside. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow iron staircase that spiraled up into blackness, its steps worn smooth by decades of use. On the walls, she noticed photographs, dozens of them all, showing the same man at different ages, always alone, always staring at something just beyond the camera's frame. The most recent couldn't have been taken more than 13 years ago, and in it, the man's eyes held a terror that made Sarah's skin crawl. As she climbed, each step echoing metallically in the confined space, she noticed scratches on the walls, as if someone had tried to claw their way out or in. The air grew colder with each turn of the spiral, and somewhere above, she could hear breathing that wasn't her own, ragged and wet, like drowning on dry land. "Who's there?" she called again, but her only answer was the sudden extinguishing of her flashlight, plunging her into absolute darkness. In that suffocating black, she heard a voice, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come. He feeds on the lonely ones." Sarah fumbled for her phone, its screen casting an eerie blue glow that only made the shadows dance more wildly. The photos on the wall seemed to move in her peripheral vision, the man's face contorting into silent screams. She turned to flee, but the stares that had been solid moments before now felt soft, organic, pulsing like a throat swallowing. That's when she saw him mourn what remained of him standing at the top of the stairs, backlit by a light that shouldn't exist. The lighthouse keeper, Thomas Ashford, according to the brass nameplate she'd noticed earlier, looked exactly as he did in the photographs, except his eyes were now hollow sockets that somehow still managed to convey profound sadness. 13 years, he said, his voice like waves against rocks. 13 years I've been keeping it at bay, and now you've let it in. Before Sarah could respond, the lighthouse suddenly blazed to life, its beam cutting through the fog with unnatural intensity. But instead of illuminating the sea, the light seemed to pull the darkness inward, creating shadows where none should exist. In those shadows, Sarah saw things that her rational mind refused to process, geometries that hurt to perceive, movements that defied physics, and always, the sense of something vast and hungry turning its attention toward her. Wait, is it? She managed to whisper. Thomas's form flickered like a bad signal. The town calls it many names. The hunger, the shadow walker, the thing that waits but names give it power. I kept it trapped here, feeding it just enough loneliness to keep it satisfied, but never enough to grow strong. One person's isolation, stretched over years, kept it weak. But you, huh? He gestured at her with translucent fingers. You bring a feast of fresh sorrow. Sarah wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Okay? The shadows were creeping closer, and she could feel them pulling at something inside her, not her life. Okay, but something more precious. Every moment of joy she'd ever experienced. Every laugh, every smile, leaving only the gray despair that had driven her to this place. How do I stop it? She asked, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Thomas's expression shifted to something like hope. The light, he said urgently, his form beginning to fade. It doesn't feed the darkness, it reveals what's already there. But if you can face it, truly see it for what it is, it loses its power. I couldn't. I ran, hid, fed it scraps of my misery for over a decade before it finally consumed me. But you still have a chance. The shadows were almost upon her now, and in their depths, Sarah saw her own fears reflected and magnified the collapse of her marriage, the loneliness that had driven her to this isolated place, the creeping certainty that she would always be alone. But then, in a moment of clarity, she understood. The creature didn't create these feelings. It simply gorged on what was already there, growing fat on human misery. No, she said firmly, taking a step toward the encroaching darkness. You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on pain that would heal if you'd let it. The shadows recoiled slightly, and Thomas's ghost grew more solid. It's it, he encouraged. Don't feed it fear, starve it with acceptance. Sarah thought of her failed marriage not as an ending, but as a lesson learned. Her solitude, not as loneliness, but as an opportunity for growth. With each reframed thought, the shadows retreated, and the lighthouse's beam grew warmer, more natural. The creature, revealed in the light, was smaller than she'd imagined, a writhing mass of need and hunger, almost pitiful in its desperation. I'm not alone, Sarah said, thinking of Schrödinger, waiting in the cottage, of the research that gave her purpose, of the calls from friends she'd been ignoring. And even if I were, that would be okay. Solitude isn't loneliness, it's a choice, and I choose to be here, whole and complete in myself. The creature let out a sound like wind through a cave, a mournful wail that spoke of eons of feeding on human misery. Then, like smoke and sunlight, it began to dissipate, growing thinner and more transparent until nothing remained but the normal shadows cast by the lighthouse beam. Thomas Ashford's ghost smiled for the first time in 13 years. Oh, thank you, he said, his voice already fading. I can finally rest. The lighthouse is yours now, if you want it. It's just a lighthouse, again, nothing more, nothing less. As his form dissolved into points of light that drifted up through the lighthouse beam and out to sea, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She descended the stairs, which were solid iron once more, and emerged into a clear night, the fog having lifted as suddenly as it had arrived. Back in the cottage, Schrödinger emerged from his carrier, purring and rubbing against her legs as if nothing had happened. Sarah made herself tea and sat on the porch, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the calm waters. Her phone buzzed with messages from concerned friends, and for the first time in months, she answered them, making plans for visits and video calls. The next morning, she found Thomas Ashford's logbook on her doorstep, but the frantic entries about shadows and darkness were gone, replaced by years of peaceful observations about weather patterns, ship sightings, and the migration of whales. On the final page, in handwriting that matched the earlier entries but seemed more at peace, were the words, "The light shows us what's there, darkness or dawn, fear or hope. We choose what we see." Sarah kept the lighthouse operational, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. It became a beacon, not just for ships, but for others like her people, seeking solitude without loneliness, peace without isolation. The town of Ravenshollow slowly forgot its whispered warnings, and the lighthouse became just another part of the landscape. It's beautiful and functional and utterly normal, sometimes on foggy nights. Sarah thought she could see Thomas Ashford in the beam of the lighthouse, not trapped or tormented, but standing watch as he always had, keeping the real darkness at bay, not the supernatural kind, but the very human tendency to let sorrow consume us came, and in those moments she would raise her tea mug in a silent toast to the keeper, who had taught her that the most powerful light we can shine is the one that illuminates our own inner landscape, revealing that what we feared as monsters were only shadows we cast ourselves. The lighthouse stood tall against the Atlantic storms, its light steady and sure, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, we have the power to choose what we illuminate. And in that choice, Sarah had found lay the difference between being alone and being lonely, between existing in darkness and choosing to live in the light. Years later, when visitors asked about the lighthouse's history, Sarah would simply smile and say, "It's had its dark periods, like all of us, but it's shining bright now, and that's what matters." And if they looked closely at the photographs she'd hung in the cottage pictures of her life, her friends, her research, and yes, even some of Thomas Ashford she'd found and restored, they might notice that in each one, the subjects were looking directly at the camera, present in the moment, no longer staring at shadows just beyond the frame. The lighthouse keeper's secret, in the end, was simple. The only darkness that can truly trap us is the one we choose not to face. And the only light that can truly save us is the one we kindle within ourselves, one small flame of hope at a time, until even the deepest shadows have nowhere left to hide. The mirror in the lake, the antique mirror, had been at the bottom of Thornfield Lake for exactly 100 years when Emma Hartley's diving light first caught its silver surface, and in that moment of discovery, she unknowingly started a chain of events that would challenge everything she believed about reflections and reality. Emma, professional salvage diver with 15 years of experience recovering lost treasures from New England's countless lakes and waterways, had been hired by the Thornfield Historical Society to search for artifacts from the old Ashwood estate, which had burned down in 1924 under mysterious circumstances. The locals spoke in hushed tones about that night, how Margaret Ashwood had been found by the lake's edge at dawn, soaking wet, despite the house being nowhere near the water, muttering about the woman in the glass before falling into a catatonia from which she never recovered. But Emma dealt in facts, not folklore. And the fact was that the Historical Society was paying her handsomely to recover whatever remained of the Ashwood family's reportedly extensive collection of antiques. "You sure you want to go down there today?" asked her diving partner, Marcus Chen, studying the unusually still surface of the lake with concern. "Water's got a weird look to it. Emma pulled on her wetsuit with practiced efficiency, checking her equipment one final time. Weird, how? She asked, though she had to admit the lake did seem different to calm, to perfect, like a massive mirror reflecting the overcast October sky. Can't put my finger on it, Marcus admitted, running a hand through his dark hair. Just feels watched, I guess. You know, I'm not usually superstitious, but this place gives me the creeps. Emma laughed, but it came out forced. Well, someone's got to stay topside and monitor the equipment. Just keep the coffee hot. This water's going to be freezing. As she descended into the dark water, her powerful diving light cutting through the murk, Emma felt the familiar peace that came with diving, the muffled silence, the weightlessness, the focus required to navigate the underwater world. The lake was deeper than the charts indicated, and she had to equalize several times before reaching the silty bottom, where the Historical Society's research suggested the Ashwood artifacts might have been dumped. At first, she found only the usual detritus-old bottles, rusted farm equipment, the skeletal remains of a robot, but then her light caught something that made her heart skip. Partially buried in the silt was an ornate mirror, its silver frame somehow untarnished despite a century underwater. The glass itself was perfectly intact, not a crack or a chip, and as Emma carefully excavated it, she noticed the frame was decorated with intricate carvings of water lilies and female figures that seemed to shift and move in the play of her diving light. Found something interesting, she said into her communicator. The excitement clear in her voice, despite the regulator in her mouth, bringing it up. But as she lifted the mirror, something strange happened. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw not her own reflection in the glass, but another woman, entirely pale, with long dark hair that floated as if she were the one underwater, not Emma. The woman's lips moved, forming words Emma couldn't hear, and her eyes held a desperate, pleading look that sent ice through Emma's veins that had nothing to do with the cold water. Then she blinked, and it was just her own masked face staring back, distorted by the water and the old glass. Emma, you okay? Your heart rate just spiked. Marcus's voice crackled through the communicator, concerned. Fine, Emma replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she secured the mirror to her lifting bag. Just got startled by my own reflection. Things in amazing condition. She sent up the lifting bag and continued her search, but found herself glancing back at where the mirror had ascended into the darkness above. The rest of the dive yielded several more artifacts, candlesticks, KT service, some jewelry, but nothing as remarkable as the mirror. When she finally surfaced, Marcus was waiting at the boat's ladder, his expression troubled. You need to see this, he said as soon as she'd removed her regulator. See what? Emma hauled herself onto the boat, already stripping off her gear. The mirror. While you were down there, I was examining it, and just look. He led her to where he'd laid the mirror on a protective blanket in the daylight. It was even more beautiful than she'd realized underwater. The silver frame gleamed as if recently polished, and the carvings were so detailed she could see individual petals on the water lilies. But it was the glass itself that made her breath catch. Instead of reflecting the cloudy sky above, it showed a clear, starry night. And in that impossible reflection stood a woman in a Victorian dress, her face turned away, standing at the edge of what looked like the very lake they were floating on. That's not possible, Emma whispered, reaching out to touch the glass. The moment her fingers made contact, the image rippled like water, and suddenly the mirror showed only their own bewildered faces. Right? Marcus said, his usual scientific skepticism warring with what they'd both seen. I thought maybe it was some kind of LCD screen, a modern fake. But Emma, I've been over every inch of this thing. It's genuine Victoriana craftsmanship. There's no power source. No. hidden electronics. It's just a mirror. Emma picked it up carefully, surprised by how light it was despite its size. As she tilted it, she caught another glimpse of something wrong for just a second. Her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, as if it were thinking about whether to follow her lead. "We should take it to Professor Rothwell at the university," she said finally. "He specializes in Victorian antiques. Maybe he can explain, ... She trailed off, not sure exactly what needed explaining. They loaded the artifacts carefully into Emma's van, the mirror wrapped in several layers of protective material. During the drive back to town, Emma found herself glancing repeatedly in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the Victorian woman sitting in her back seat. Marcus, following in his own car, called her twice to make sure she was okay. That night, Emma brought the mirror home, telling herself it was for safekeeping until she could get it to the professor in the morning. She lived alone in a restored farmhouse on the outskirts of Thornfield, a place she'd chosen for its isolation and proximity to the various lakes she worked. She propped the mirror against the wall in her living room and tried to go about her evening routine: dinner, emails, a little television, but found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the antique glass. It wasn't until she was preparing for bed that she noticed it. The mirror's reflection showed her living room, but with subtle differences. The furniture was the same, but arranged differently. The walls were papered instead of painted, and gas lamps replaced her electric lights. And there, in the reflected version of her favorite armchair, sat the woman from the lake. Emma's heart hammered as she approached the mirror slowly. The woman was younger than she'd first appeared, maybe mid-20s, with sad eyes and pale skin that seemed to glow in the gaslight of that other room. She was looking directly at Emma now, and when Emma raised her hand, the woman did too, not mirroring the gesture, but reaching out as if trying to touch her through the glass. "Who are you?" Emma whispered. The woman's lips moved, and this time, impossibly, Emma could hear her, the voice coming not from the mirror, but from somewhere inside her own head. "I am Margaret Ashwood. And I have been waiting so long for someone to find me." Emma stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp in her haste. "That's not possible." Margaret Ashwood went insane. She died in an asylum in 1925. The woman in the mirror, Margaret, shook her head sadly. "My body died. Yes, dead. But she trapped me. Here first, trapped me in the in-between. She wanted what was mine, my life, my place, my Edmund. And on the night of the fire, she took it all." "Who's she?" Emma asked, though part of her couldn't believe she was having a conversation with a reflection. Margaret's image flickered, as if something was interfering with the connection. "My reflection," she said, her voice growing fainter. She was always there, copying my every move, learning to be me. I thought it was vanity to spend so much time before the glass, but she was studying, planning. And that night, when the moon was dark and the veil was thin, she pulled me through and took my place. Emma's rational mind rebelled against what she was hearing, but she couldn't deny what she was seeing. "How do I help you?" she found herself asking. "The mirror must be destroyed," Margaret said urgently. "But not just broken, it must be unmade, dissolved back into the elements from which it was crafted. Okay? Only then will the boundary be sealed, and both of Uche and I will be at peace." "Both of you," Kama repeated, but Margaret's image was fading, replaced by Emma's own reflection. Except now she noticed that her reflection's expression held something cold and calculating that didn't match her own confused face. She backed away from the mirror, grabbing her phone to call Marcus. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. "Emma, it's past midnight. What's wrong?" "The mirror," she said, the words tumbling out. "I think it's... No, this sounds crazy, but I think it's some kind of portal. There's a woman trapped inside, and she says her reflection switched places with her." And she stopped, realizing how insane she sounded. There was a long pause before Marcus spoke. "I'm coming over," he said, simply. "Don't do anything with the mirror until I get there." While she waited, Emma researched the ashwood fire on her laptop, keeping one eye on the mirror. What she found chilled her more than the dive in the lake. Margaret Ashwood had indeed been found by the lake after the fire, but the newspaper accounts were contradictory. Some said she'd been trying to save family heirlooms, others that she'd set the fire herself, but all agreed on one detail. In the weeks before the fire, Margaret had undergone a complete personality change. The shy, bookish young woman had suddenly become vivacious and bold, taking a lover Edmund Carlyle despite being engaged to another man, hosting wild parties that scandalized the conservative town, and displaying a cruel streak that was completely at odds with her previous character. Like she was a different person, Emma murmured, staring at the mirror. Reflection stared back, and was it her imagination, or was there a slight smirk on those familiar lips? Marcus arrived within the hour, bringing with him an assortment of equipment-y MF readers, infrared cameras. Things Emma recognized from paranormal investigation, shows she'd always mocked. I know, he said, seeing her expression, "but I figured we should document whatever's happening here." They set up the equipment around the mirror, and almost immediately, the readings went wild. The EMF detector shrieked, the temperature dropped to 10 degrees, and the infrared camera showed a cold spot directly in front of the glass. Then Margaret appeared again, clearer this time, as if their equipment was somehow strengthening the connection. "She knows you're here," Margaret said, her eyes wide with fear. "She's been watching through every mirror, every reflection, waiting for her chance. Don't let her touch the glass from your side. If she does, she can pull you through just as she did me." "How do we destroy it?" Emma asked. "We need to unmake it properly." Where Margaret's explanation was cut short as the mirror suddenly went dark, reflecting nothing at all. Then, slowly, another figure materialized identical to Margaret, but with cruel eyes and a predatory smile. "Hello, Emma," the false Margaret said, her voice honey-sweet, but with an undertone that made Emma's skin crawl. "I've been waiting for someone like you, someone strong, capable, with a life worth taking." Poor, pathetic Margaret was hardly worth the effort, but you, ... you'll do nicely. The mirror began to ripple like water, and Emma felt the pull, gentle, at first but growing stronger, drawing her toward the glass. Marcus grabbed her arm, anchoring her, but the pull intensified. The formula, the real Margaret's voice, came faintly, as if from a great distance, in the Ashwood Grimoire, page 390, for the unmaking ritual. Emma wrenched herself away from the mirror's pull. "Marcus, we need to get to the Historical Society now." They left the mirror where it was, though Emma felt its presence like a weight even as they drove through the empty streets. The Historical Society was closed, of course, but Emma had keys from her salvage work. They made their way to the archive room, searching frantically through boxes of ashwood materials until Marcus triumphantly held up a leather-bound book. "Got it?" He flipped to page 394, where spidery handwriting detailed the ritual for unmaking a reflected portal. The ingredients were surprisingly simple: salt, silver shavings, water from the lake where the mirror was found, and ... blood from one who has looked upon both sides, Emma read. "That would be me, I guess." They gathered what they needed, racing against time. Emma could feel something changing, a wrongness in the air that made every reflective surface windows, puddles, even Marcus's glasses seemed threatening. Back at her house, they found the mirror glowing with an eerie light. The false Margaret was pressing against the glass from the inside, her hands leaving frost patterns where they touched. "Too late," she hissed. "The boundary weakens. Soon I'll be free to find a new life to steal, and this time I won't be content with just one." Emma and Marcus worked quickly, following the ritual instructions. They mixed the components in a silver bowl, Emma adding 3 drops of her blood to the mixture. As they began to pour it over the mirror, the false Margaret screamed, a sound like breaking glass that made their ears ring. The mirror began to crack, but not in the way of breaking. Instead, it seemed to be dissolving, melting like ice in spring. The false Margaret's image distorted, stretched, her beautiful face revealing something ancient and hungry underneath. But as she dissolved, the real Margaret appeared one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, and Emma could see peace in her eyes. "We can both rest now." The mirror collapsed in on itself, leaving only a puddle of silvery liquid that evaporated. Within seconds, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and Emma's house felt normal again. Just a house, no longer haunted by reflections that moved of their own accord. In the aftermath, they found records in the Ashwood grimoire that explained more. The mirror had been created by Margaret's grandmother, a woman whispered to be a witch who had tried to capture and bind her own wayward reflection. But such magic came with a price. Generation. The trapped reflection grew stronger, more cunning, waiting for its chance to escape. Margaret had simply been the unlucky heir who looked too long and too deeply into the cursed glass. Emma and Marcus never spoke publicly about what happened that night. The other artifacts from the lake were donated to the Historical Society, but the mirror was listed as destroyed during recovery. Emma continued her salvage work, though she found herself avoiding mirrors for months afterward. And she never dove in Thornfield Lake again, sometimes on still mornings when the lake was like glass. Locals reported seeing 2 women standing at the water's edge, one in Victorian dress, one in modern clothes, both looking out over the water with peaceful expressions before fading with the morning mist. And if sometimes Emma caught her reflection moving just a fraction of a second too slowly in her bathroom mirror, she simply looked away and reminded herself that some depths, weather, and lakes were better left unexplored. The mirror in the lake had kept its secrets for 100 years, and now those secrets were finally laid to rest, dissolved like morning dew under the forgiving sun. In the end, Emma learned the most terrifying monsters weren't the ones hiding in dark waters or haunted mirrors, but the ones that wore familiar faces and coveted lives that weren't their own. But even they could be defeated with courage, friendship, and the wisdom to know that some reflections should never be trusted, no matter how perfectly they seemed to mirror our world's. Horror stories. Script. I was 19 at the time and had just started my sophomore year of college. I was living in this old apartment building near campus that had been converted from a house sometime in the 1960s. The rent was cheap, which was perfect for my budget, but the place had its quirks. My unit was on the 2nd floor and had this weird layout where you had to walk through the kitchen to get to the bedroom. It was a Thursday night in October, and I had just finished studying for a midterm. I remember because I had been stressed about it all week and was finally able to relax. I made some ramen and was eating it while watching Netflix on my laptop around 10 p.m. when I heard footsteps coming up the stairs outside my door. This wasn't unusual since there were 3 other apartments in the building, but something about these footsteps was different. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I could see shadow under the crack. I paused my show and listened carefully. Usually, when my neighbors came home, they would just go straight to their doors, but this person was just standing there. For about a minute, I heard them try my door handle. Didn't turn because I always kept it locked, but the sound of someone testing it made my heart race. I quietly got up from my couch and went to the peephole. Through it, I could see a man I didn't recognize. He was middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket, and he was looking around nervously. He tried the handle again, then started walking down the hall, checking the other doors. I watched him try each one, but they were all locked too. What happened next still gives me chills. He came back to my door and just stood there staring at it. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a small screwdriver or pick. He started working on my lock. I grabbed my phone and called 911, immediately whispering to the operator about what was happening. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that officers were on their way. I could hear the man still working on my lock, and I was terrified. He was going to get it open. The building was old, and the locks weren't exactly high security. I grabbed a kitchen knife and hid behind the counter where I could see the door, but hopefully wouldn't be seen if he got in, after what felt like forever. But it was probably only 5 minutes. I heard sirens approaching. The man must have heard them, too, because suddenly the noise at my door stopped. I looked through the peephole again and saw him hurrying down the stairs. When the police arrived, they found that he had damaged not just my lock, but all the locks in the building. He had been systematically trying to break into every apartment. They never caught him, but the landlord installed new deadbolts on all the doors the next week. What scared me most was that this wasn't random. He had come prepared with tools and had a plan. If I hadn't been awake and alert, he might have succeeded in getting into my apartment or one of my neighbors. I still wonder what he was planning to do once he got inside. This happened when I was 25 and living in my first house. It wasn't much, just a small 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, but I was proud to finally be a homeowner. I had been living there for about 6 months and felt completely comfortable with the area and my neighbors. I work as a nurse, so I'm used to working different shifts, including nights. This particular week, I had been working 3 consecutive night shifts and was exhausted. I got home Friday morning around 8 a.m. and all I wanted to do was sleep. I closed all the curtains, drew the blackout shades in my bedroom, and fell into bed. I slept heavily until around 3 p.m. when I woke up to use the bathroom. As I was walking back to my bedroom, I glanced out the living room window and saw something that made me freeze. There was a van parked across the street that I had never seen before. It was an older model white panel van with no windows on the sides. What caught my attention wasn't just the van itself, but the fact that I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. I watched for a few minutes and the person never moved. They were just sitting there facing my house. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe someone waiting to pick up a neighbor or a repair person taking a break. I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Asterisk. When I woke up again around 6 p.m., the van was still there. Same position, same person in the driver's seat. Now I was definitely concerned. I called my neighbor across the street, who I had become friendly with, and asked if she knew anything about the van. She said she had noticed it too, and that it had been there since at least noon. She was getting worried as well. I decided to call the police and report a suspicious vehicle. They said they would send someone to check it out. About 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up behind the van. I watched from my window as an officer got out and approached the driver's side. Okay, almost immediately, the van started up and drove away quickly. The officer followed it for a few blocks, then came back and knocked on my door. The officer told me that when he approached the van, the driver had been holding binoculars and had several notebooks on the passenger seat. When asked what he was doing, the man claimed he was bird watching, but couldn't explain why he needed to watch birds from inside a van on a residential street. The officer got his license plate number and told me to call immediately if I saw the van again. I didn't see it the next day, but on Sunday, around the same time in the afternoon, it was back. This time, I called the police right away. When they arrived, the van left again before they could make contact. This pattern continued for almost 2 weeks. The van would show up, park across from my house for hours, then leave whenever police arrived. Finally, one day, I decided to be proactive. I set up my camera on a tripod by my window and recorded the van for several hours. I also wrote down everything I could observe about the driver and the vehicle. When the police arrived that day, I gave them the footage and my notes. It turned out the man had been surveilling several houses in the neighborhood, not just mine, okay? He had notebooks full of information about resident schedules when they came, and went, what cars they drove, and what houses appeared to be empty. The police arrested him and found burglary tools in his van, along with detailed floor plans of several houses, including mine. During the investigation, they discovered he had been casing the neighborhood for over a month, planning a series of break-ins. He had specifically targeted houses where people lived alone and had learned their work schedules so he would know when to strike. The fact that I worked night shifts and slept during the day had made me a prime target. What terrifies me is how close I came to being victimized. If I hadn't happened to wake up and notice the van, he probably would have broken into my house within days. The police said, based on his notes and tools, they believed he was planning to do more than just steal property. He had weapons in them. Bannon had made notes about the physical characteristics and habits of several women in the neighborhood. I was 28 and had been living alone in a small apartment for about 2 years. It was a nice place in a decent neighborhood, and I had never had any problems. The building had about 12 units, and most of my neighbors were young professionals. Like me, we all pretty much kept to ourselves, but it felt like a safe place. This happened on a Saturday in late November. I had spent the day running errands and grocery shopping. I got home around 4 p.m. and put everything away, then decided to do some cleaning. I had my music playing and was in a good mood, just tidying up and organizing. Around 7 p.m., I ordered Chinese food for delivery. When the doorbell rang, I went to answer it, expecting to see the delivery guy. I looked through the peephole and saw someone holding what looked like food bags, so I opened the door. But instead of the friendly delivery person I was expecting, there was a stranger standing there with my food. He was probably in his 30s, tall and thin, with an intense stare. When I opened the door, he immediately stepped forward like he was trying to come inside. I held the door firmly and asked if he was from Golden Dragon, the restaurant I had ordered from. He said yes, but something felt wrong. The delivery people from that restaurant knew me by name since I ordered regularly, and they were always wearing uniforms or at least shirts with the restaurant logo. This guy was wearing plain clothes. I asked to see the receipt, and he fumbled around in the bags for a moment before handing me a crumpled piece of paper. The order was correct, but when I looked closer, I noticed the receipt was handwritten, not printed like they usually were. Also, the total was different from what I had been quoted on the phone. I told him I needed to verify the order and started to close the door so I could call the restaurant. He immediately put his foot in the doorway, preventing me from closing it. That's when I knew for certain something was very wrong. I pushed against the door and told him to move his foot, but he just stared at me with this creepy smile, let go of the door, and ran to get my phone. As soon as I did, he pushed the door open and came into my apartment. I screamed and dialed 911 while running toward my bedroom. He followed me, but when he heard me talking to the emergency operator, he suddenly turned around and left, dropping the food bags on my floor. When the police arrived, they found that the real delivery person had been robbed just 2 blocks from my apartment. The man had taken his food and his delivery receipt, then come to my door, pretending to be him. The actual delivery guy was shaken up, but not seriously hurt. He said the man had approached him, claiming to be a customer who wanted to pick up his own order, then grabbed the food and pushed him down. The police were able to get a good description from both me and the delivery person, but they never caught the guy. What scares me most is that this wasn't a random crime. They had specifically targeted a food delivery to gain access to someone's home. The officer told me that home invasion robberies using this method had been increasing in the area. I still order delivery sometimes, but now I always verify the person's identity before opening the door. I asked them to describe what I ordered, or I called the restaurant to confirm they sent someone. It's scary to think how easily he almost got into my apartment. What might have happened if I hadn't noticed the inconsistencies with the receipt? I was 24 and working at a small marketing company downtown. The job required a lot of late hours, especially when we had big campaigns or deadlines. This was during one of our busiest periods, and I had been staying at the office until 9 or 10 p.m. Most nights for about 2 weeks. Our office was in an older building that housed several small businesses. During the day, it was bustling with activity, but after 6 p.m., it became pretty quiet. Most of the other companies had normal business hours, so by the time I was finishing up for the night, the building was usually empty except for the cleaning crew. On this particular Thursday night, I was the last one in our office. My co-workers had left around 6 p.m., but I needed to finish preparing materials for a client presentation the next day. I was deep into my work with my headphones on when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was a man standing in the doorway of our office just watching me. I pulled out my earbuds and looked at him. He was middle-aged, wearing maintenance coveralls and holding a clipboard. I assumed he was part of the cleaning crew, even though I had never seen him before. I said hello and asked if he needed something. He smiled and said he was doing a security check of all the offices and needed to verify that everyone working late had proper authorization. This seemed reasonable enough. I knew the building had security protocols, and with all the late nights lately, it made sense they would want to check on people. I showed him my employee ID and company key card. He looked at them and made some notes on his clipboard, then asked a few questions about what I was working on and how late I planned to stay. Something about his questions seemed odd though. He asked very specific things, like whether anyone else knew I was staying late and whether my boss expected me to check in when I left. When I asked why he needed to know these details, he said it was standard procedure for insurance purposes. He was friendly and professional, so I answered his questions. After about 5 minutes, he thanked me and said everything looked good. He mentioned that he would be doing his rounds throughout the building for the next hour or so, and that I should call the security desk if I needed anything. He gave me a business card with a phone number and left. I went back to my work, but something was nagging at me. The questions he had asked seemed more focused on my personal safety than on security protocol. Also, I realized I had never seen a security desk in the building and wasn't even sure there was one. I decided to call the number on the business card just to be safe. The number was disconnected. I was getting worried. I called our building management company and asked about the security check. The person I spoke with told me they didn't have anyone doing security checks that night and that they would send someone over immediately to investigate. Asterisk, while I was waiting, I started packing up my things. I didn't want to be alone in the office anymore. As I was gathering my materials, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I looked up and saw the same man walking past our door again. This time, he wasn't carrying a clipboard, and he moved quickly like he was trying not to be seen. I locked our office door from the inside and called 911. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and not to leave the office until police arrived. I sat in the dark, listening to sounds in the hallway. I could hear doors opening and closing and footsteps moving around the building. It sounded like someone was going through all the offices. When the police arrived, they found that several offices had been broken into. The man had used the information he gathered from talking to people to determine which offices would be empty and which might have valuables. He had taken computers, tablets, and cash from petty cash boxes. The officer told me that by asking about my schedule and whether anyone expected to hear from me, he was probably planning to rob our office after I left. The scary part is that if I hadn't gotten suspicious about his questions, I might have worked for another hour or two, completely unaware that he was planning to come back. If he had returned while I was still there and found me as a witness to his break-ins, who knows what he might have done to keep me quiet. The building installed better security, installed systems after that, and required all maintenance and security personnel to wear official ID badges. But the experience made me realize how vulnerable we can be in situations we think are safe. I never worked late alone again, without letting someone know exactly where I was and when I planned to leave. This happened 3 years ago when I was 30. I had recently gotten divorced and moved into a small house that I was renting in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. It was exactly what I needed at the time, a fresh start in a peaceful location where I could focus on rebuilding my life. The house was perfect for me. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a small backyard. The neighborhood was family-friendly with tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. My neighbors seemed nice, and I felt safe walking around in the evenings or working in my garden during the day. I had been living there for about 3 months when I started noticing small things that seemed off. At first, it was just little things that I attributed to being forgetful or stressed from the divorce. I would find cabinet doors open that I thought I had closed, or items in my kitchen moved to different locations. Figured I was just distracted and not paying attention to what I was doing. But then I started finding things outside that were more concerning. My garbage cans would be moved from where I had left them, or I would find footprints in my garden beds that weren't mine. One morning, I discovered that someone had been looking through my mail. The mailbox wasn't damaged, but letters and bills were shuffled around differently than how the mail carrier usually left them. I mentioned these incidents to my neighbor, thinking maybe she had seen something suspicious. She was an older woman who spent a lot of time in her front yard and seemed to notice everything that went on in the neighborhood. When I described what had been happening, she got a concerned look on her face and told me she had seen a man in my yard several times over the past few weeks. According to her, he usually came around during the day when most people were at work. She had assumed he was a maintenance person, or maybe someone I had hired to do yard work. But when I told her I hadn't hired anyone, she realized something was wrong. She described him as being in his 40s, wearing ordinary clothes and always carrying a small bag or backpack. This information made me extremely uncomfortable. The thought that someone had been regularly coming onto my property and going through my things was terrifying. I decided to install a security camera system that would let me monitor my property remotely through my phone. The cameras revealed the extent of what had been happening. Over the next week, I captured footage of the man coming to my house almost every day. He would walk around the entire property, looking in windows, checking doors, and going through anything that wasn't locked up. He spent particular attention on my bedroom and bathroom windows, trying to see inside, even though he kept the curtains closed. The most disturbing footage showed him sitting on my back porch for over an hour, just watching the house. He had a notebook and appeared to be writing things down. At one point, he tried several windows and doors to see if any were unlocked. When he found that everything was secure, he used some kind of tool to try to manipulate the locks. I took all of this evidence to the police immediately. They were very concerned, especially when they saw the footage of him attempting to break in. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and set up surveillance of their own to try, to catch him in the act. It took almost 2 weeks, but they finally arrested him when he came back to my property. During questioning, he admitted that he had been watching me and several other women in the area. He had detailed notes about our schedules, our habits, and our home security measures. The police found that he had already broken into 2 other houses in nearby neighborhoods. What scared me most was discovering the level of planning he had put into stalking me. He knew when I left for work, when I came home, what time I went to bed, and when I was likely to be in different parts of my house. He had been building a profile of my life so he could find the perfect opportunity to break in when I would be most vulnerable. The officer handling the case told me that stalkers like this often escalate from surveillance to more serious crimes. They believed that if he hadn't been caught, he would have eventually broken into my house while I was home. Given the detailed notes he had about my bedroom and bathroom, it was clear his intentions went far beyond simple burglary. I moved out of that house within a month. Even though he was in jail, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound at night made me think he had somehow gotten out, or that there might be someone else doing the same thing. I learned to be much more aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if it seems minor at the time. I was 26 and had just started a new job that required me to travel frequently. The company put me up in extended stay hotels, which was convenient since I might be in the same city for weeks at a time. This particular assignment had me staying in a hotel in a mid-sized city in the Midwest for almost a month. The hotel was decent, nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable. It was one of those places that caters to business travelers with small kitchenettes and separate sleeping and living areas. My room was on the 3rd floor at the end of a long hallway. During the week, the hotel was busy with other business travelers, but on weekends, it was pretty quiet. I had been staying there for about 2 weeks when I started noticing that things in my room seemed to be slightly different when I came back from work. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, or maybe housekeeping was moving things around while they cleaned. But it kept happening, even on days when I specifically requested that housekeeping not service my room. The changes were subtle. My laptop would be in a slightly different position on the desk, or clothes in my suitcase be folded differently than how I had left them. One day, I found that my bathroom items had been rearranged. Nothing was missing and nothing was damaged, but someone had definitely been going through my belongings. I started paying closer attention to how I left things and even took photos of my room before leaving each morning. When I compared the photos to how things looked when I returned, there was no doubt that someone was entering my room while I was gone. I complained to the front desk, but they insisted that only housekeeping had access to my room and that they would investigate. The next day, I decided to test this theory. I left for work as usual, but came back after only 2 hours claiming I had forgotten something important. When I got to my room, I could immediately tell someone had been there. My bed, which I had made carefully that morning, was slightly unmade, and there were wet footprints on the bathroom floor, even though the bathroom had been completely dry when I left. I confronted the front desk manager and demanded to know who had been in my room. She seemed genuinely surprised and concerned. She checked the electronic lock records and found that my room had been accessed twice that morning, once by housekeeping and once by someone using a master key. The problem was that no one should have used a master key because I had specifically requested no service that day. The manager and I went back to my room together to investigate further. While we were there examining the lock and looking for signs of tampering, we heard a sound from the adjoining room. The manager explained that the rooms were connected by a door that could be unlocked from either side, but was normally kept locked for privacy. We knocked on the adjoining room, got no answer, even though we could hear movement inside. The manager used her master key to open that room, and we found a man hiding in the bathroom. He was a hotel employee who worked in maintenance. In his possession were master keys to all the rooms and a collection of personal items that he had stolen from guests, including some of my things. Asterisk, during the investigation, it came out that he had been systematically entering guest rooms for months. He would study guest patterns to know when people were likely to be out, then use his access to go through their belongings. He was particularly focused on rooms occupied by women traveling alone. He had been taking small, personal items that guests might not immediately notice were missing, like jewelry, underwear, and personal care products. The most disturbing part was that he had been taking photos of personal items in room interiors. The police found hundreds of photos on his phone, including pictures of women's clothing, laid out on beds and intimate personal belongings. They believed he was selling these photos online to people with similar interests. What haunts me is knowing that this person had unlimited access to my room and had been coming in regularly while I was gone. He had been going through my most personal belongings and photographing them for his own purposes. The violation of privacy was overwhelming, and it made me question how safe any of us really are in places we expect to be secure. Asterisk, I checked out. of that hotel immediately, and the company moved me to a different property. But the experience changed how I travel. I always use the secondary locks on hotel doors now, and I never leave valuable or personal items where they might be easily found. I also take photos of my room before leaving so I can tell if anyone has been inside while I was gone. This story takes place when I was 23 and living in my first apartment after college. It was a small, one-bedroom place in an older building, but it was affordable and in a decent neighborhood. I had been living there for about 8 months and felt comfortable with the area and my daily routines. The building had 12 units spread across 3 floors. Most of my neighbors were quiet, and we rarely interacted beyond polite greetings in the hallway. The building entrance required a key to get in, and each apartment had its own deadbolt, so I felt reasonably secure. It was early spring, and I'd just started a new job that required me to leave the house earlier than I was used to. My new schedule had me leaving around 7 a.m. and getting home around 6 p.m. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal with the new routine. But then I started noticing that my apartment felt different when I came home. It's hard to explain, but there was a sense that someone had been there while I was gone. The air felt different, and there were subtle changes that made me think someone had been moving around inside at first. I dismissed these feelings as paranoia from adjusting to the new job and schedule. But then I found concrete evidence that someone had been in my apartment. I came home one evening to find that my bed had been slept in. The sheets were wrinkled and the pillows were indented in a way that clearly showed someone had been lying. There, I was terrified. I searched the entire apartment to make sure no one was still inside, then called the police immediately. They came and took a report, but there was no evidence of forced entry. All my windows and doors were still locked, and nothing appeared to be missing. They suggested that maybe I had forgotten that I had taken a nap before leaving for work, but I knew that wasn't the case. Over the next few days, I paid extremely close attention to how I left my apartment each morning. I made my bed perfectly and arranged things in very specific ways so I would be able to tell if anything had been disturbed. When I came home that evening, it was obvious that someone had been there again. This time, they had used my shower and had made themselves food in my kitchen. I was so scared I couldn't stay in the apartment that night. I had packed a bag and stayed with a friend while I tried to figure out what to do. The next day, I spoke with my building manager about changing the locks, but she said there had been no reports of break-ins and that changing locks was expensive and not something they would do without clear evidence of a security breach. Frustrated with the lack of help, I decided to install a hidden camera in my living room so I could see what was happening while I was at work. The camera was small and wireless, and I could monitor it remotely through an app on my phone the first day. I didn't capture anything unusual, but on the second day, the camera recorded something that made my blood run cold. Around 10 a.m., a man entered my apartment using a key. He was completely comfortable and familiar with the space, moving around like he belonged there. He made breakfast, cooked coffee, and spent several hours watching TV and using my computer. What was most disturbing was how he behaved like he was at home. He showered, changed into clothes from my closet, and even took a nap in my bed. Around 3 p.m., he cleaned up after himself, did my dishes, and left through the front door, locking it behind him. I took the video evidence to the police immediately. The detective was shocked by what the footage showed and launched a full investigation. Within 2 days, they had identified the man as a former maintenance worker for my building who had kept copies of master keys when his employment ended several months earlier. During questioning, he admitted that he had been living in my apartment during the day while I was at work for almost 3 weeks. He had studied my schedule and determined that I was always gone for at least 10 hours, giving him plenty of time to treat my apartment like his own home. He had been doing the same thing to 2 other apartments in the building, choosing units where single women lived alone. The investigation revealed that He had been unemployed and essentially homeless since losing his job at the building. Instead of finding somewhere legitimate to stay, he had been rotating between different apartments, using his knowledge of resident schedules to avoid being caught. He had detailed notes about when each person left for work and when they typically returned home. What terrifies me most about this experience is how long it went on without me realizing the full extent of it. This person had been living in my space, using my belongings, and invading my privacy for weeks. He had access to all my personal information, my computer, my mail, and my most intimate living spaces. The landlord finally agreed to change all the locks in the building and implement better security measures. But I moved out within a month because I never felt safe there again. Every time I came home, I wondered if someone might be inside, waiting for me, or if someone had been there while I was gone. This experience taught me to always trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if I can't immediately explain why. Those subtle feelings that someone had been in my apartment were my subconscious, picking up on real evidence that my conscious mind hadn't fully processed. Now, I always pay attention to those gut feelings because they might be warning me about dangers I haven't yet recognized. The Mirror Lake incident happened in the fall of 2019. I was 26 at the time and going through a pretty rough patch in my life. I'd just ended a long relationship and was feeling like I needed to get away from everything for a while. My buddy Jake had told me about this remote lake up in the Cascade Mountains in Washington that was supposedly incredible for camping. He called it Mirror Lake, though I'm not sure if that was its actual name or just what locals called it because of how perfectly it reflected the surrounding peaks. The thing about this place was that it wasn't on any official trail maps. Jake had found it through some old forestry worker who mentioned it in passing. You had to hike about 3 miles off the main trail, following these little cairns that someone had built over the years. It was the kind of place that maybe saw a handful of visitors per year, if that. I drove up there on a Thursday morning in late October. The weather was perfect, crisp, but not cold, with these amazing fall colors everywhere. I parked at the main trailhead and started the hike around 9 a.m. The first part was easy. It's just your standard Pacific Northwest trail through Douglas firs and cedars. But when I had to veer off the main path, things got more interesting. Following those cairns was like following breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Some of them were obvious, nice, neat stacks of rocks. Others were just a couple stones balanced on top of each other, and I had to really look for them. A few times I thought I'd lost the trail completely, but then I'd spot the next marker. The whole thing felt mysterious and adventurous, exactly what I was looking for. Asterisk, after about 2 hours of hiking through increasingly dense forest, started to hear water. Not like a rushing stream, but more like gentle lapping. The trees began to thin out, and then suddenly I broke through into this clearing, and there it was, Mirror Lake. Jake wasn't kidding about the name. The water was so still and clear that it looked like a giant mirror had been dropped into the forest. The lake wasn't huge, maybe 200 yards across, but it was perfectly round and surrounded by these towering evergreens. On the far side, there was a sheer rock face that rose straight up, maybe 300 feet, and the whole thing was reflected so perfectly in the water that for a second I got vertigo looking at it. There was a small clearing on the side where I'd emerged, just big enough for a tent and a fire ring that someone had built with stones from the lake shore. It was absolutely perfect. I set up my tent facing the water and spent the rest of the afternoon just sitting there, watching the light change on the surface. I caught a couple small trout for dinner and felt more relaxed than I had in months as the sun started to set behind the trees. The lake took on this golden glow. I built a small fire and was just enjoying the peace when I noticed something across the water. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but there seemed to be some kind of structure over there, maybe 50 yards down from the rock face. It was getting dark, so I couldn't make it out clearly, but it looked like it might be another campsite, or maybe even a small cabin. I was actually kind of excited about this, even though I had come here to be alone. The idea that there might be other people around was comforting. Plus, I was curious about who else knew about this hidden spot. Called out across the water, "Hello? Anyone over there?" My voice echoed off the rock face, but there was no response. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The silence was so complete, it was almost like being in a sensory deprivation chamber. I woke up around sunrise, feeling completely refreshed. The first thing I did was look across the lake to see if I could get a better view of whatever I'd seen the night before. In the morning light, I could clearly see that there was indeed a structure over there. It looked like a small log cabin, but something about it seemed off. Even from across the water, I could tell it was old and probably abandoned. Part of the roof looked like it had caved in, and there were gaps in the walls where logs had fallen out. I decided to explore. The lake wasn't that big, and I figured I could walk around it in maybe 30 minutes. I left my campsite and started working my way around the shoreline. The going was slow because there wasn't really a trail, just rocky shore and fallen logs too. Climb over. When I got closer to the cabin, I could see it was in worse shape than I thought. It was definitely abandoned, probably for decades. The door was hanging open on broken hinges, and most of the windows were just empty frames. But what struck me as odd was that there were recent signs of activity around it. The area in front of the door had been cleared of debris, and there were the remains of several campfires in a ring of stones nearby. I approached carefully and called out, "Hello, anyone here?" I got no response. The inside of the cabin was mostly open to the elements, with fallen beams and rotting floorboards. But in one corner, that was still somewhat intact. Someone had set up what looked like a temporary camp. There was a sleeping bag laid out, some canned goods stacked against the wall, some various camping supplies. What made me uncomfortable was how the sleeping bag was positioned. It was placed right where someone lying down would have a direct view, across the lake to where my campsite was. I could see my orange tent clearly through the broken window frame. I backed out of the cabin and started to head back around the lake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me from across the water. As I walked, I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone in the doorway of the cabin. When I got back to my campsite, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just another hiker who'd found this place and decided to camp in the shelter of the cabin rather than out in the open. That would make sense. And maybe they'd gone for a day hike or something. The fact that the sleeping bag was positioned to look across the lake could just be coincidence, but I couldn't completely convince myself. Something about the whole setup bothered me. Who would choose to camp in that decrepit cabin instead of somewhere more pleasant? And why hadn't they responded when I called out? I spent the day fishing and trying to enjoy myself, but I found myself constantly glancing across the water. A couple times, I thought I saw movement near the cabin, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. As evening approached, I built my fire again and cooked the fish I'd caught. The sun was setting behind me, which meant the cabin across the lake was getting darker while my campsite was still lit up by the dying sunlight. I felt exposed, like I was on a stage with someone watching from the audience. Just as it got fully dark, I saw a light appear in the cabin. It was dim, like from a candle or a small lantern, and it was positioned right in that window that faced my campsite. The light didn't move around like someone would be doing if they were just going about their business in the cabin. It stayed steady, pointed in my direction. I decided to try calling out again. "Hey there, I'm camped across the lake. Want to come over and share the fire?" My voice echoed back from the rock face, but there was no response. The light stayed exactly where it was. This went on for maybe an hour. I had tended my fire and tried to act normal, but that light was always there, unmoving, like someone was just sitting and staring across the water at me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I called out louder, "I know you're there. What do you want?" The light immediately went out. I sat by my fire for another hour, but the light didn't come back on. Eventually, I decided to just go to bed and try to put it out of my mind. But as I was getting into my tent, I could swear I heard something from across the water. It sounded like splashing, like someone was walking into the lake. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it across the water, but I couldn't see anything. The sound had stopped. I kept the flashlight on for several minutes, scanning back and forth. But the surface of the lake was perfectly still. I barely slept that night. Every little sound made me jump the wind in the trees, a fish jumping, an owl calling, and a few times I was sure I heard that splashing sound again. But whenever I looked out of my tent, there was nothing. Around 3 a.m., spooka to what sounded like someone walking around my campsite, 4 steps on the rocky shore, circling my tent. I laid there, frozen, listening. The steps would stop for a moment, then continue. They made a complete circuit around my tent, then stopped right outside the entrance. I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate breathing, like someone was standing right outside, listening to me. I held my own breath, trying to be as quiet as possible. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped, and I heard those soft footsteps moving away toward the water dot. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then very quietly unzipped my tent, just enough to peek out. In the moonlight, I could see wet footprints leading from my tent to the water's edge. They disappeared into the lake. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just laid in my tent with my knife in my hand, listening for any sound. When the first light of dawn started to show through the tent walls, quickly packed everything up and got out of there. The hike back to my car felt like it took forever. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but I made it out safely and drove straight home. I never did find out who was at that cabin or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone who didn't like strangers in their secret spot. Or maybe it was someone who shouldn't have been out there at all. Either way, I never went back to Mirror Lake, and I've never told anyone else how to find it. Asterisk, the Whispering Pines Trail. This happened last summer when I was doing a solo backpacking trip through the Wind River Range in Wyoming. I've been planning this trip for months, a 5-day loop through some of the most remote wilderness in the lower 48. The trail I chose was called the Whispering Pines Trail, though most of it was actually above the tree line. The name came from the first day's hike through this dense forest of lodgepole pines that would make this eerie whistling sound when the wind blew through them. I started the hike on a Tuesday morning in July. The weather forecast was perfect. Sunny skies, mild temperatures, almost no chance of rain. I was carrying everything I needed for 5 days, so my pack was pretty heavy. But I was in good shape and looking forward to the challenge. The first few hours of hiking were incredible. The Whispering Pines lived up to their name every time the wind picked up. These haunting musical notes would drift through the forest. It was beautiful, but also kind of unsettling, like the trees were trying to communicate something. About 4 hours in, I came across another hiker coming from the opposite direction. This was the first person I'd seen since leaving the trailhead, which wasn't surprising given how remote this area was. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with a big gray beard and the kind of weathered look that comes from spending a lot of time outdoors. We stopped to chat, as hikers usually do. He asked where I was headed, and when I told him about my planned route, his expression changed. He got this serious look and said, "You might want to reconsider that. I've been coming out here for 20 years, and I've never seen the forest like this." I asked him what he meant, and he pointed back in the direction he'd come from. "Something's wrong up there. The wildlife is all spooked. Haven't seen a single bird or squirrel all day. And the smell? ... He shook his head. Just be careful, son. Trust your instincts. I thanked him for the warning, but honestly, I thought he was being overly dramatic. Experienced wilderness guys sometimes get superstitious about things that probably have perfectly reasonable explanations. Maybe there was a bear in the area that had the other animals on edge. Or maybe a forest fire from years ago had left some lingering effects. I wasn't going to change my whole trip based on one guy's gut feeling, but as I continued hiking, I started to notice what he was talking about. The forest was unusually quiet. No bird songs, no chattering squirrels, no rustling in the underbrush. It's that constant whispering from the wind in the pines. And there was a smell, not quite rotten, but sour and unpleasant, like something organic decomposing. I made camp that first night at a designated backcountry site near a small stream. It was a beautiful spot, but the silence was oppressive. I'd been camping and backpacking for years, and I'd never experienced such complete quiet in a forest. Even at night, there should be owls, coyotes, insects making noise. But there was nothing except that wind through the pines. I tried to shake it off and focus on enjoying my dinner in the peaceful setting. But as darkness fell, that whispering sound seemed to get louder and more insistent. Sometimes it almost sounded like actual whispers, like people having a conversation just out of earshot. Kept looking around, expecting to see other campers nearby, but I was completely alone. Around midnight, I was woken up by the most god-awful smell. It was like something had died right outside my tent. Not just died, but been rotting for weeks. I held my breath and listened, wondering if maybe a bear had brought a carcass near my campsite. But I didn't hear any sounds of an animal moving around. The smell was so strong, I was starting to gag. I had to get some fresh air. I grabbed my headlamp and unzipped my tent. The smell hit me like a physical blow. I actually stumbled backward and almost fell. But when I shined my light around the campsite, there was nothing there. No dead animal, no rotting log, nothing that could account for that overwhelming stench. The weird thing was, smell seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was strongest right outside my tent, but when I walked a few steps in any direction, it was just as bad, like it was in the air itself. I couldn't sleep in that smell, so I packed up my tent and moved to a spot about 100 yards away, upstream, along the creek. The smell seemed to be weaker there, though it never completely went away. I spent the rest of the night dozing fitfully in my sleeping bag under the stars. When morning came, I was relieved to find that the smell had mostly dissipated. I convinced myself that it had probably been some kind of weird atmospheric thing, maybe gases from decomposing vegetation in a marsh somewhere being carried by the wind. I'd heard of things like that happening. I broke camp and continued on the trail. The second day's hike was supposed to take me up above the tree line to this incredible alpine meadow that was famous for wildflowers. But as I climbed higher, that smell kept coming back in waves, and the silence was getting even more pronounced. When I finally broke out of the tree line, what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The meadow was there, but it was completely dead. What should have been a carpet of colorful wildflowers was just brown, withered stalks. It looked like everything had died at once. It's like the whole ecosystem had just suddenly given up. I walked out into the meadow, trying to understand what I was seeing. The dead plants crunched under my feet like dried leaves in fall, but this was the middle of summer, in an area known for its lush vegetation. I knelt down and examined some of the plants more closely. They weren't just dead, they looked almost burned, but not by fire. It's more like they'd been poisoned or exposed to some kind of radiation. That sour smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. And now I could see where it might be. coming from. Scattered throughout the meadow were what looked like piles of dead animals. Deer, elk, smaller creatures I couldn't identify from a distance, all in various states of decay. I should have turned around right then. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out of there. But I was morbidly curious about what could have caused such widespread death. I approached one of the larger carcasses carefully. It was an elk, big bull that probably weighed 800 pounds when it was alive. But something was wrong with it beyond just being dead. Its body was deflated, like something had sucked all the fluids out of it, The hide was still intact, but it was lying flat against the bones, like a collapsed balloon. And the eyes were completely gone. Not picked out by scavengers, but like they'd just dissolved. I backed away from the carcass, my heart pounding. This wasn't natural. I'd seen plenty of dead animals in the wilderness, roadkill, winter, kills, animals taken by predators. But I'd never seen anything like this. It was like something had drained the life out of everything in this meadow. I was getting ready to turn around and head back when I noticed movement on the far side of the meadow. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but as I watched, I realized it wasn't moving like a person. It was too fluid, wrong somehow. I pulled out my binoculars and focused on the movement. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was humanoid in shape, but definitely not human. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and impossibly thin. Its skin was pale gray, almost translucent, and it moved with this unnatural gliding motion, like it was floating just above the ground. As I watched, it stopped near one of the dead animals and seemed to feed, though I couldn't see exactly what it was doing. The carcass that had still had some form to it suddenly deflated completely, becoming just a pile of hide and bones. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and ran back toward the tree line, my heavy pack bouncing on my shoulders. Could hear something behind me, not footsteps, but more like a rushing wind. I didn't look back until I was well into the trees, when I finally stopped and turned around. There was nothing following me. The meadow looked empty and still from where I stood, but I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't going to stick around to see it again. I hiked back down the trail as fast as I could manage with my full pack. I didn't stop for lunch, didn't take any breaks except to drink water. I just wanted to get as far away from that dead meadow as possible. I made it back to my car just before dark, cutting a 5-day trip down to 2 days. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale figure standing on the road behind me. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe it? But I did some research when I got home, looking for any reports of mass animal deaths in that area. I found a few mentions on obscure forums of hikers finding dead wildlife, but nothing official. The Forest Service website for that area just had a generic warning about hazardous conditions, and recommended that hikers choose alternate routes. I haven't been back to Wyoming since then, and I've never been able to get that image out of my head. That thing in the meadow, feeding on whatever life force those animals had left. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I can smell that sour, death-like odor, damp. But it's never there. At least, I hope it's never there. The midnight photographer this story is from about 3 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was going through a photography phase at the time. I had invested in this expensive DSLR camera and was really into taking landscape and night sky photos. I'd heard about this spot in the Adirondacks called Phantom Ridge that was supposed to have some of the darkest skies on the East Coast. Perfect for astrophotography. The ridge was about a 4-hour hike from the nearest parking area, and most of the trail was pretty steep, but the payoff was supposed to be incredible. A wide, flat area on top of the ridge with 360-degree views and no light pollution for miles in any direction. I'd seen photos other people had taken there, and the star shots were absolutely stunning. Planned to hike up on Friday afternoon, camp overnight, and then spend Saturday night taking photos before hiking out Sunday morning. I brought my camera gear, tripod, and enough supplies for 2 nights of camping. The hike up was tough, but beautiful. It was late September, so the fall colors were at their peak. The trail wound through dense hardwood forest for the first few miles, then opened up into more sparse pine and birch as I got higher. By the time I reached Phantom Ridge, the sun was just starting to set. The description I'd read online didn't do the place justice. It was a broad, rocky plateau, maybe 200 yards across, with stunted pine trees around the edges and open rock in the center. The views in every direction were incredible, rolling mountains, as far as I could see, but no signs of civilization except for one distant radio tower blinking red in the far distance. I set up my tent in a sheltered spot near some trees. Then spent the rest of the evening scouting locations for photos and getting my camera gear ready. As the sun set and the stars started to come out, I realized why this place was so famous among photographers. The sky was absolutely brilliant, more stars than I'd ever seen in my life, with the Milky Way clearly visible as a bright band across the heavens. I spent the first few hours taking test shots and adjusting my camera settings. Night photography requires long exposures, sometimes 20 or 30 minutes. So I'd set up a shot, start the timer, and then just sit and wait while the camera did its work. The silence up there was incredible. No traffic, no planes, no sounds of civilization at all. Around midnight, I was setting up for what I hoped would be my best shot of the night. I'd found this perfect composition with a dead pine tree in the foreground and the Milky Way arcing overhead. I got everything framed just right, started the 25-minute exposure, and settled in to wait. That's when I noticed the other light dot. At first, I thought it might be another photographer. The light was dim and had that reddish tinge that photographers use to preserve their night vision. It was maybe 100 yards away, near the far edge of the ridge, but something about it bothered me. It wasn't moving around like someone adjusting camera equipment. It was just there, steady and unmoving. Called out, "Hello," another photographer, but there was no response. The light didn't move or change at all. I was curious now. I'd hiked for hours to get to this remote spot, and the idea that someone else had done the same and was camping nearby was interesting. Maybe we could share tips or even collaborate on some shots. I decided to walk over and introduce myself. I grabbed my red flashlight and started across the rocky plateau toward the other light. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't at ground level like it should be if someone was setting up a camera. It was elevated, maybe 8 or 10 feet off the ground, like it was mounted on a pole or being held up by someone very tall. I stopped about 50 yards away and called out again, "Hey there, mind if I come over and say hello?" Still no response. The light remained perfectly steady. I was starting to feel uneasy. Who camps in the wilderness and doesn't respond when someone calls out to them? And what would require a light source that high off the ground? I decided to approach more cautiously. As I got within about 20 yards, I could see that the light source wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't a flashlight or headlamp. It was more like a lantern or camping light, but it had this weird quality too. The light seemed to bend and shift slightly, like it was shining through water, and there was no one holding it. The light was just hanging in midair, about 10 feet off the ground, with no visible means of support. No pole, no tree branch, nothing. Just this eerie, wavering light floating in the darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks. My rational mind was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was some kind of weather balloon with a light attached. Or maybe there was a very thin support wire I couldn't see in the darkness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. As I stood there staring, the light began to move. Not quickly, but with a slow, deliberate motion that was definitely intentional. It drifted toward me, maintaining that same height off the ground, covering maybe 20 feet in the span of a minute. That's when I decided I had seen enough. I turned and walked quickly back toward my campsite, resisting the urge to run. My camera was still running its long exposure, so I couldn't just pack up and leave immediately. But I definitely wasn't going to investigate that floating light any further. When I got back to my camera setup, I glanced back toward where the light had been. It was gone. The far side of the ridge was completely dark again, just like it had been when I first arrived. I tried to focus on my photography, but I kept glancing in that direction. Maybe 15 minutes later, the light reappeared. But this time, it was in a completely different location on the opposite side of the ridge. It hung there motionless for several minutes, then began that same slow, deliberate movement, this time parallel to the tree line. Over the next hour, I saw the light appear and disappear maybe 5 or 6 times, always in different locations, around the perimeter of the ridge. Sometimes it would drift slowly along the tree line. Other times it would hover in one spot for long periods before vanishing. But it never came close to my campsite again. I was getting genuinely spooked. Whatever that light was, it was definitely not normal. And the way it moved seemed almost like it was patrolling the area, like it was looking for something, courting something around 2 a.m. I was packing up my camera gear and getting ready to retreat to my tent when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It sounded like a camera shutter. The distinctive click whir of a DSLR taking a photo, followed by the mechanical sound of the mirror flipping. The sound came from the direction where I'd first seen the floating light. I froze, listening intently. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Click whir. Then again, someone or something was taking pictures, but there was no flash, no light source that would indicate a photographer working. It's just that mechanical sound echoing across the ridge in the darkness. I grabbed my red flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. I couldn't see anything, but the camera sound stopped immediately. After a few minutes of silence, I turned the light off. Almost immediately, the camera sounds started again. Click whir, methodical, like someone taking a series of shots with a motor drive. I tried the flashlight again, and again the sounds stopped. It was like whatever was out there didn't want to be seen, but was perfectly happy to continue its photography as long as I wasn't looking. This went on for maybe 20 minutes. The invisible photographer would take pictures for a while, then stop when I used my light, then resume when I turned it off. And slowly, the sounds were getting closer to my position. Finally, I'd had enough. I quickly finished packing my camera gear and retreated to my tent, zipped it shut, and lay in my sleeping bag, listening to those mechanical camera sounds moving around outside. The sounds circled my tent several times, stopping occasionally as if the photographer was taking shots of my campsite. At one point, I could swear the sound was right outside my tent wall, maybe 3 feet away. I held my breath and didn't move, praying that whatever was out there would lose interest and go away. Eventually, sounds moved away and finally stopped altogether. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay in my tent, listening and watching for any sign of that floating light. When dawn finally came, I packed up as quickly as possible and started the hike back down the mountain. I didn't see any trace of whoever or whatever had been sharing the ridge with me. No footprints, no camping gear, no evidence that anyone else had ever been there. But as I was descending the trail, about an hour below the ridge, I found something that made me question everything I thought I'd experienced. Hanging from a tree branch right beside the trail was a digital camera, memory card in a clear plastic bag. I almost didn't take it, but curiosity got the better of me. I stuffed it in my pocket and continued down the mountain. When I got home, I put the memory card in my computer to see what was on it. There were maybe 50 photos, all taken with a high-end camera and clearly shot on the ridge where I'd been camping. But these weren't landscape or star photos. They were all pictures of me. Photos of me setting up my tent. Photos of me adjusting my camera equipment. Photos of me walking across the ridge toward the floating light. Photos taken from impossible angles, like from high above or from positions where no human could have been standing. The last photo on the card was the most disturbing. It was taken from inside my tent, looking out through the mesh screen. You could see my face clearly, eyes wide open, staring directly into the camera lens. But I have no memory of ever seeing a camera or flash inside my tent. I deleted all the photos immediately and destroyed the memory card. I've never been back to Phantom Ridge, and I've never told anyone this story until now. But sometimes, when I'm out taking photos in the wilderness, I get the feeling that something is watching me from the darkness, taking pictures of its own. And I always check my camera bag when I get home, just to make sure there aren't any memory cards that don't belong to me. Silent Trails. 3 real encounters that changed my life, which fall of 2017 when I decided to revisit a small forest preserve up in northern Michigan where I used to hike as a teenager. I was 25 at the time and going through a rough patch in life, relationships ending, job burnout. All that's all I figured. A solo weekend trip in the woods might help me clear my head. I remembered this one specific spot that wasn't even part of a marked trail. It was just something me and a couple of high school friends stumbled across years ago. An old path that wound through some thicker forest and eventually opened up to a dry, grassy clearing beside a shallow creek. Nobody ever used it, not officially. Anyway, so on a Friday morning, I packed up a small tent, some supplies, and drove 4 hours out there. Parked at a ranger station that was closed for the season, then followed the old path. Took me about an hour to reach the spot. I remember stepping into the clearing and feeling that wave of nostalgia mixed with total silence. It was peaceful, but different than I remembered. The air felt heavier, like the forest had been holding its breath for a while. I set up my tent near the creek and spent the day hiking nearby, collecting small sticks for a fire, and mostly just letting my brain rest. Around sunset, I made a simple fire, warmed some canned soup, and stared at the sky through the swaying trees above. I was just starting to relax, finally, when I heard a sound I didn't expect. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I froze, holding my spoon halfway to my mouth. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It was coming from the woods just beyond the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 or 40 feet out. I stood up, quietly put the soup down, and grabbed my flashlight. Rocky terrain, branches snapping. Under each step, this wasn't an animal. It's too slow, too spaced out. I turned the light toward the sound, but the beam hit nothing. It's trees. Still, the footsteps stopped the second I clicked the flashlight on. I waited, its light scanning between the trunks, but there was nothing. Eventually, I sat back down, but I didn't touch my food again. Instead, I let the fire burn out slowly and got into my tent just after 9 p.m. I zipped it shut and lay there, listening to around midnight. I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, pacing along the tree line like someone was circling the clearing, staying just out of sight. I didn't dare unzip the tent. Instead, I lay there, barely breathing, staring at the thin nylon fabric above me and wishing I had brought something more than a flashlight. The footsteps didn't stop for a long time. They circled and circled, sometimes pausing, sometimes speeding up, but they never came closer. And just before dawn, they stopped completely. When I finally stepped out of the tent at sunrise, there were footprints, deep ones, boots, not animal prints. They circled my tent at least 5 times, but the trail I used to get there, it was still empty. No other tent, no parked car, just me, whoever was out there. Ever never left, tour, never arrived by trail at all. I left by mid-morning, and I never went back. This next story happened 2 years later. In 2019, I had just gotten into solo camping more seriously and was doing a series of weekend trips in remote areas. This one was in Idaho, near the Sawtooth Mountains, the Lawaz, a primitive site known as Lone Pine, with nothing more than a stone ring for a fire and a cleared patch big enough for a couple of tents. When I arrived, the sun was still pretty high. The air was clean, mountain crisp, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the trees. No people for miles. That was the appeal. I set up camp, filtered some water from a nearby stream, and even strung up a bear bag just in case. Kay was well prepared this time. The first weird thing happened that evening. Around 7:30, I heard a voice, a single sentence, whispered, just loud enough to be caught in the wind. It said, "You shouldn't be here." I stood up from my folding stool and scanned the area. No one in sight. Just as I convinced myself it was the wind, I heard it again, the exact same words, same tone, same direction. East, toward the dense trees. I called out, but no one answered. I even hiked 30 yards into the woods, checking between trunks and underbrush, but nothing. As the sun set, I lit a fire and tried to act like it was just my nerves. Maybe someone passed through earlier, and I was just hearing echoes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent with a fire dimly glowing outside, every rustle and snap sending my pulse through the roof. And then, around 1 a.m., the voice came again. This time, it was right outside the tent. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was spoken clearly, calmly, okay, and close. I unzipped the tent in one quick motion and jumped out with my flashlight raised, but there was no one. The fire was out. The woods were dead quiet. I stood there shaking, flashlight beam darting through the dark, but nothing moved. That night, I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed up everything and left. I stopped at a ranger station on my way home and told them what I'd experienced. The ranger didn't say much, just looked at me with a strange expression and told me they'd get reports like that from Lone Pine every few years. I asked him, what kind of reports? Lone said, the kind you don't ask twice about. Last summer, in 2023, I planned a short stay at a remote cabin I found listed on a small outdoorsy website. It was described as off-grid, peaceful, and surrounded by untouched forest. Perfect, I thought. Asterisk, the instructions said to park near a gravel loop, then hike 1 mile east until I saw a red marker tied to a tree, then follow the narrow trail behind it. I did just that, and sure enough, the cabin appeared small, wooden, covered in moss, but sturdy. A front porch, 2 rocking chairs, and a small chimney. No power, no cell signal. Just me and the wild dot. At first, everything was perfect. I lit a fire in the small wood stove inside, made tea, and sat reading a paperback while rain tapped lightly on the roof. That night, I heard only wind and the occasional owl hoot. Hook. It was peaceful, but the next morning, things started to feel off. I went outside to gather some dry twigs for the stove, and when I turned around, the cabin looked different. It looked older. The porch was sagging slightly, the rocking chairs missing. The red marker on the tree was gone. I walked around too, the back, and found deep scratches along the wooden siding, like something had tried to claw its way inside. I was so sure this wasn't how it looked yesterday. I stepped back inside. Everything was where I left it, the book, the stove, the blanket, but the air smelled rotten, like damp earth and mildew and something long dead. I spent the rest of that day inside, only venturing out once to check if my trail back was still marked. It wasn't. There was no red marker, no visible path. That night, I barely slept. The cabin creaked and groaned more than before. At one point, I heard knocking on the back wall. No wind, no trees nearby, just knocking, steady and slow. I sat in the corner, holding the fire poker, wide-eyed and frozen. Around 3 a.m., I finally passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, the cabin was gone. I mean that literally. I was lying on damp earth, wrapped in a blanket I'd used, but the cabin was no longer there. Just an empty patch of ground, like it had never been built. No stove, no porch, no scratches, nothing. I had no idea what direction the road was. My compass spun wildly when I tried to use it. I ended up wandering for 4 hours before finally finding the gravel loop where my car was parked. I still don't know what happened, if I hallucinated the cabin, if it was some temporary hunting shack someone had removed, or if something far stranger occurred out there in the woods. All I know is this: I followed the directions. The cabin was real. I slept in it, and then it vanished. I haven't gone camping since. The music box at midnight. The music box had been silent for 47 years when Claire Morrison first wound its delicate key, and as the haunting melody began to play, she had no idea she was awakening something that should have remained forever sleeping. Claire, an estate sale coordinator with a reputation for handling the most challenging properties, had been hired to manage the contents of Greystone Manor, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had stood empty since its last owner, Eleanor Blackwood, had died under mysterious circumstances in 1976. The local real estate agents whispered that Eleanor had been found in the music room, seated at the piano as if playing, though her fingers were still and her eyes were closed, a peaceful smile on her face that seemed at odds with the fact that she'd been dead for 3 days before anyone found her. A Claire dealt in objects, not ghost stories, and Greystone Manor was filled with treasures that would fetch excellent prices at auction. "You'll want to be careful with the items in the music room," advised Mrs. Henley, the elderly woman who served as the estate's caretaker, her roomy eyes holding a warning that seemed disproportionate to the task. Miss Eleanor was very particular about her collection, especially the music boxes. She said they held memories, though whose memories, she never did say. Claire had smiled politely, making notes on her tablet about the woman's superstitions. They often added provenance value to pieces if she could spin them the right way. The manor was a treasure trove of Victorian and Edwardian antiques, each room perfectly preserved, as if waiting for owners who would never return. But it was the music room that took her breath away. Dozens of music boxes lined the shelves, from simple wooden cases to elaborate automatons, their silent figures frozen in eternal dance. At the center of the collection, displayed on a marble pedestal, sat the crown jewel, an intricate music box featuring a ballroom scene, complete with a dozen tiny couples frozen mid-waltz around a mirrored floor. That one was Miss Eleanor's favorite, Mrs. Henley said from the doorway, refusing to step into the room. She'd wind it every night at midnight, regular as clockwork. Said it helped her remember happier times, though what times those were, I couldn't tell you. She never married, never had children, just lived here with her music and her memories. Claire approached the music box reverently. It was exquisite, clearly 18th century French, worth a small fortune to the right collector. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each tiny figure detailed down to the buttons on the gentlemen's coats and the miniature fans in the ladies' hands. A small golden key protruded from the side, begging to be turned. "Has it been wound since Miss Eleanor passed?" Claire asked, but when she turned, Mrs. Henley had vanished, leaving only the echo of her footsteps retreating down the hallway. Unable to resist, Claire turned the key 3 times, feeling the ancient mechanism engage with surprising smoothness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with the whisper of hidden gears, the music began a waltz she didn't recognize. Beautiful, but somehow discordant, as if played in a minor key that didn't quite match the elegance of the scene. The tiny figures began to move, circling the mirrored floor with mechanical precision. But as Claire watched, mesmerized, she noticed something odd. One of the dancing couples moved differently from the others, their steps more fluid, more alive, and in the miniature mirrors that lined the ballroom walls, she could swear she saw not reflections of the other dancers, but glimpses of a real ballroom, full-sized, where shadows waltzed to the same haunting tune. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said behind her, and Claire spun around, heart hammering. A young woman stood in the doorway, dressed in modern clothes, but with something indefinably old-fashioned about her bearing. "I'm sorry," the woman said, smiling. "It's not mean to startle you. I'm Sophia Blackwood, Eleanor's great-niece. I heard someone was finally cataloging the estate." Claire's heart rate slowly returned to normal. "Claire Morrison," she said, extending her hand. "I didn't know Miss Eleanor had any living relatives." Sophia's handshake was oddly cold. "Distant ones," she said, her eyes fixed on the music box, which was still playing its eerie waltz. "I used to visit when I was young. Aunt Eleanor would let me watch when she wound the music boxes, but never that one. She said it was special, that it held a complete memory, not just an echo." "A complete memory?" Claire asked, intrigued despite herself. Sophia moved closer to the music box, her fingers hovering over but not quite touching the glass dome that protected the dancing figures. She claimed that music boxes could capture moments, preserve them like insects in amber. Most only caught fragments, few notes, a feeling. But this one, ... this one caught an entire night. The last waltz at the Greystone Christmas Ball, December 23rd, 1929. Claire wanted to laugh at the fanciful notion, but something in Sophia's expression stopped her. "That's quite a story," she said diplomatically. "Stories have a way of becoming truth in places like this," Sophia replied. "Tell me, Miss Morrison, do you believe in hauntings?" Before Claire could answer, the music box's melody shifted, becoming louder, more insistent. The dancing figures spun faster, and in the mirrors, Claire caught glimpses of something impossibly grand ballroom filled with people in 1920s finery, all waltzing to the same tune. And there, at the center of it all, a young woman who looked exactly like Eleanor Blackwood's portrait, dancing with a handsome man in a midnight blue coat. "That's her," Sophia whispered. "Eleanor, on the night she fell in love with Thomas Ashford. He was engaged to another, but for that one night, that one dance, they forgot everything but each other." The music reached crescendo, and suddenly, Claire wasn't just watching the scene in the mirrors. She could smell perfume and cigarette smoke, feel the warmth of bodies pressed close and dance, hear the rustle of silk and the murmur of conversation beneath the music. The room spun, and when it stopped, she was standing in the ballroom itself. No longer miniature, but life-sized, surrounded by dancers who didn't seem to see her. "What's happening?" Claire gasped, but Sophia was no longer beside her. Instead, she stood across the room, but now she wore a beaded dress and her hair was pinned in finger waves. She smiled sadly and shook her head, pointing to the center of the dance floor. As Claire followed her gesture and saw them, Eleanor and Thomas, lost in each other's eyes as they danced. But something was wrong. The other dancers moved in perfect loops, repeating the same steps, the same turns of their heads, the same frozen smiles. Only Eleanor and Thomas seemed real, seemed alive, and with growing horror, Claire realized why. They weren't memories, they were trapped, forced to dance the same waltz for eternity, caught in the music box's mechanical embrace. "How do I get out?" Claire called to Sophia, but the woman just kept pointing. Then Claire saw it thereon, Thomas's collar, a small pin in the shape of a music note. As she watched, the pin began to glow, pulsing in time with the music. It pushed through the mechanical dancers, their bodies solid but yielding like mannequins, until she reached the central couple. Up close, she could see the desperation in Eleanor's eyes. the way they flickered with awareness before being pulled back into the dance. "Eleanor," Claire said urgently. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" Just a moment. The young woman's eyes focused. "On her, break it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. "Break the key. Set us free." The music box. Claire had to get back to the music box. But how? The ballroom seemed to stretch on forever, the dancers multiplying, the waltz growing louder and more discordant. She closed her eyes, trying to remember that she was really in the music room at Greystone Manor, that this was all some kind of illusion. "You can't leave," a man's voice said. Claire opened her eyes to find Thomas Ashford standing before her, his handsome face twisted with despair. "We tried for so long, but the music always pulls us back. It's made sure of that." "Who made sure?" Claire asked. Thomas's form flickered like a candle flame. "Margaret Ashford, my wife. She knew about Eleanor and me, knew we planned to run away. After Christmas, she cursed the music box, trapped us in our last happy moment. Except happiness becomes hell when you can't escape it." The waltz stuttered, skipping like a broken record, and in that moment of disruption, Claire saw her chance. She ran for the mirrors lining the ballroom walls, hoping there were windows back to reality. She pressed her hands against the glass and felt it yield, soft as water. With a deep breath, she pushed through. She tumbled back into the music room at Greystone Manor, gasping and disoriented. The music box was still playing, but now she could see the truth. The central dancing couple weren't just automata. They were Eleanor and Thomas, shrunk and imprisoned, forced to dance forever in their miniature prison. "Have to break it," Sophia said, and Claire realized she'd never left, had been standing there all along. "I've tried for years, but I'm bound by blood. Eleanor was my great-aunt, but also my grandmother. Thomas Ashford was my grandfather. Their affair resulted in my mother, raised in secret, told her father died in the war. Only family can break family curses, but as their descendant, I'm trapped to why I can enter the memory, but I can't destroy it." Claire grabbed the music box, looking for the key. It was still there, still turning, though she hadn't wound it that much. She grasped it firmly and tried to pull it out, but it wouldn't budge. "Not the key," Sophia said urgently. "The mirror, the ballroom floor. That's what traps them, forced to see their reflection, their happiness, twisted into torment. Break the mirror, break the curse." Claire looked at the miniature ballroom, at the mirrored floor where the tiny figures danced. Key, she could see Eleanor and Thomas clearly now, their faces pleading. Without hesitation, she grabbed a heavy bookend from a nearby shelf and brought it down on the music box. Okay. The glass dome shattered first, raining fragments like snow. But the music continued, growing, louder, more desperate. She struck again, this time hitting the mirrored floor directly. The mirror cracked, spiderwebbing from the center, and the music began to slow, distort, like a phonograph winding down. "Can," Sophia urged, and Claire could see her form flickering too, becoming translucent. She raised the bookend one more time and brought it down with all her strength. The mirrored floor exploded, and with it, the music stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. The tiny figures froze mid-dance. Then, one by one, they began to crumble into dust. All except to Eleanor and Thomas stood in the ruins of their prison, and as Claire watched, they began to grow, becoming translucent, human-sized. They stood before her, young and beautiful, holding hands. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice like wind chimes. 47 years of the same waltz, the same night, the same stolen moment. Margaret thought she was condemning us, but she didn't. Understand, even hell can be bearable if you're with the one you love, but bearable isn't living. Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "We stayed for Sophia," he said. "Our granddaughter, though she never knew us in life. Born of love, but raised in secret, visiting the aunt who was really her grandmother, never knowing the truth until it was too late. Sophia stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I've spent 20 years trying to free you," she said. "Ever since I learned the truth, since I realized why I could see you in the mirrors, why the music boxes sang differently for me." Eleanor reached out, her ghostly hand passing through Sophia's cheek in a gesture of tenderness. "You have freed. U.S., dear one. You found someone with the courage to do what needed to be done. Live, Sophia, lived a life we couldn't." The three figures began to fade, but they were smiling now, at peace. Just before they vanished completely, Claire heard the faintest whisper of music, not the tortured waltz of the music box, but something sweeter, simpler, a lullaby perhaps, or a song of farewell. The music room fell silent. Where the music box had stood, there was only a pile of broken glass and twisted metal, already tarnishing as if aging decades in seconds. Sophia stood, staring at it, her form now solid, real, the ghostly quality Claire hadn't even consciously noticed now gone. "You're real," Claire said, somewhat stupidly. Sophia smiled, a sad but genuine expression. "Real as anyone can be who's spent half their life talking to ghosts." I wasn't lying. I'm Eleanor's great-niece, but I'm also her granddaughter. My mother never knew the truth, died thinking her father was a war hero. It was only when I came to settle her affairs that I found the letters, the documents, the truth. She picked up a shard of the broken mirror, examining her reflection. "I've been coming here for 20 years, trying to break the curse. But curses are specific things, had to be broken by someone who wasn't family, someone who could enter the memory without being trapped by blood. Eleanor knew that. Eventually, someone would come to catalog her treasures, someone with the sensitivity to see what was really there." Claire sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly shaky. "So all of this was ... what? A plan 47 years in the making." "Love makes us patient," Sophia said simply, and desperate. Eleanor couldn't rest, knowing Thomas was trapped with her. She might have endured hell alone, but she couldn't bear watching him suffer for their love. She stood, brushing glass dust from her clothes. "I should go. The house is yours to catalog, now really yours. No more ghosts, no more cursed music boxes, just antiques and memories, the ordinary kind." "Wait," Claire said. "What will you do now?" Sophia paused at the door, considering. "Live, I suppose. It's been so long trying to free the dead that I forgot to have a life of my own. Maybe it's time I learned to dance to my own music, not just the echoes of the past." After she left, Claire sat alone in the music room, surrounded by silent music boxes. She wound a few, listening to their melodies, simple, sweet tunes that held no trapped souls, no cursed dancers, just music, preserved in springs and gears, waiting to bring a moment of beauty to whoever chose to listen. She cataloged the collection carefully, noting provenance and probable values. The shattered music box she swept into a bag, planning to dispose of it properly. But as she worked, she found herself humming not the twisted waltz that had trapped Eleanor and Thomas, but something lighter, a melody she'd heard just once in those final moments as the ghosts faded away. The other music boxes sold well. At auction, each finding homes with collectors who appreciated their craftsmanship in history. Claire kept one for herself, a simple wooden box that played Claire de Lune when wound. Sometimes, late at night, she would wind it and think about the couple who had danced the same dance for 47 years, and about the granddaughter who had loved them enough to spend 20 years seeking their freedom. The Greystone Manor was eventually sold and converted into a bed and breakfast. It's ghost stories now, just marketing charm rather than trapped souls. But Claire noticed that the new owners had turned the music room into a library, and she wondered if, On some level, they sensed that room had held enough music, enough memories, for several lifetimes. On the anniversary of that night, Claire received a postcard. It showed a couple dancing at what looked like a Parisian cafe. And on the back, in elegant handwriting, were just 2 words: living. She smiled and tucked the postcard into the frame of her mirror, where it served as a daily reminder that some prisons were of our own making, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was not holding on, but letting go. The music box at midnight had played its last waltz, and in its silence, 3 souls had finally found their freedom. Claire wound her own music box, letting Debussy's gentle notes fill her apartment, and raised a cup of tea in a quiet toast to Eleanor and Thomas, wherever they were now, dancing to whatever music the universe played for souls finally at peace. And if sometimes, in the reflection of her mirror, she caught a glimpse of a ballroom of dancers in vintage clothes, of a love that transcended death and decades wound, she simply smiled and looked away, knowing that some memories deserved to remain undisturbed, perfect in their imperfection, eternal in their ephemeral beauty. Voices in the trees, 3 terrifying experiences deep in the wild back in 2021. I took a solo canoe trip through the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. I've done this kind of thing before, 4-day solo paddle with my tent and gear loaded into the canoe. I enjoyed the stillness, the mental reset, but I'll never forget what happened on the second night. It was late September, so it was already chilly during the evenings. I paddled across the lakes that day and found a good island to set up camp. No one else had signed the trail log at the last portage, and I hadn't seen another soul since I left the outfitter station. I was alone, and that was part of the appeal. The island wasn't huge, maybe 2 acres, but big enough for some trees and a little flat ground. I made camp, gathered wood, and had a small fire going by nightfall. By 9 p.m., the sky was pitch black and full of stars. I remember being so still that I could hear the faintest ripples of water lapping at the shore. That's when I first heard it. A splash heavy, like something big, dropped into the lake. Not a fish. I turned toward the noise, but I couldn't see much past the flickering firelight and the edges of my lantern's glow. I assumed it was a beaver or a deer crossing near the shallows. Then came the voice, quiet but unmistakable. Hello? I froze. There was no boat, no light, no sounds of paddling. It's just that one word, spoken low, coming from across the water. I stood up, turned off my lantern, and waited. Nothing. The wind was still. Trees didn't rustle. Then, again, Helu. It didn't sound scared. It sounded ... curious, neutral, but wrong. There's something about a voice that carries across still water at night. It has this eerie sharpness to it. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the source of the sound. A thin mist hovered over the lake, and through the fog, I swear, I saw the outline of a figure just standing in the water, waist deep, not moving. I called out, "Who's there?" But I got nothing back. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, almost perfectly still. I stayed frozen like that for maybe 5 minutes, waiting to see if they'd move. Then I blinked out. They were gone. It's gone. The ripples faded, and the water went flat again. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent felt like footsteps. Every shadow looked like someone waiting. By sunrise, I packed and paddled for 7 hours straight until I hit the ranger cabin. I told them what I saw. The old ranger didn't even blink. He said, "Yeah, that happens. You're not the first." The second story happened 3 years earlier when I was hiking in the Oregon Cascades. I had this 3-day solo hike planned along a trail I'd done before, but this time I wanted to veer off and find a spot to camp deeper in the woods. The weather was dry, the forest was quiet, and I was feeling great. By day 2, I hadn't seen anyone for almost 24 hours. Around midday, I followed a smaller offshoot trail that wasn't on the map, probably made by deer or hunters. It led me down a slope, then curved into a small basin covered in old-growth pines. The sun barely touched the floor through the thick canopy. It was absolutely silent. No wind, no birds, no insects, just quiet. It's a kind of quiet that feels wrong. Still, I set up camp. I was used to solitude, and I chalked it up to being deeper in the forest. That evening, while I was cooking rice over my little burner, I heard something above me, not in front, not beside me, above. It was laughter, not a loud, joyful laugh, not even a chuckle, just a weird, distant, echoey laugh. It's like someone giggling into a hollow log. The creepy part wasn't just the sound, it was how slow and deliberate it was. I looked up, expecting to maybe see a bird or monkey or something, but there was nothing in the trees. I called out, "Is someone up there?" But the forest gave me back silence. Then I heard it again, time behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight all around the base of the trees. Still nothing. I decided then and there to skip dinner. I shoved everything into my pack, doused my burner, and grabbed my knife. The laughter started a third time closer now, less echo, more ... human. I didn't sleep. I just sat by a tiny fire with my back against a tree until morning, when the sun came up. I left the basin and hiked 8 hours without stopping. Whatever was up in those trees, damn, it didn't want me there. I still have no idea how a human could be up in those massive pines with no ropes, no gear, and no sign. This last story happened in 2022 in a desert area just outside Moab, Utah. I was road tripping and planned a night of dispersed camping in the Bureau of Land Management land. It was legal, open, and free to camp just you, your gear. In the wild, I arrived at a small clearing down a dirt road with tire tracks, so I knew people had used it before. The cliffs rose up on one side, and scrub brush surrounded the area. It was a beautiful place. I parked my SUV, set up a small fire ring, and started cooking. As night fell, I saw the glow of another campfire on a ridge maybe 200 yards away. I figured someone else had the same idea. I waved my flashlight toward them, but got no response, no movement. Just the glow of the fire. After an hour, I noticed something strange. The fire wasn't flickering like a normal flame. It was steady, consistent, no smoke. And yet, it was still glowing, never getting brighter or dimmer. Around 10 p.m., I decided to walk up to say hi. I figured I'd introduce myself, maybe chat a bit. So I took my flashlight and headed toward the ridge. As I climbed, the fire seemed to get ... farther away. I'd walked 50 feet and it looked no closer. I walked another minute and still, it stayed the same distance. The trail narrowed between two boulders, and as I came through the gap, the fire vanished. Just ... gone. No smoke, no embers, no sound. The ground where it should have been was undisturbed. No fire ring, no footprints, no warmth in the sand. Then I heard shuffling behind me. I spun around with the flashlight, but there was nothing. It's just empty desert. And then a whisper right in my ear. You saw it too. I ran, full speed. I didn't look back. Bite. I got to. My SUV threw everything inside and peeled off that dirt road. I drove an hour before stopping. I never camped in Moab again. Asterisk, the summer of '97. I'm 44 now. Married with kids of my own. But there are still nights when I wake up thinking about what happened that summer when I was 16. My son just turned 16 last month. And looking at him now, seeing how young and innocent he still is, despite thinking he's invincible, it reminds me of how naive we all were back then, how unprepared we were for what we encountered in those woods. It was the summer of 1997, okay? Right before my junior year of high school. My best friend Marcus and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd gotten our licenses the year before and finally had enough freedom to plan our own adventures without our parents hovering over us. Marcus had this beat-up Toyota pickup truck that his older brother had passed down to him, and we thought we were so cool driving around town in that thing. The plan was simple: drive up to the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas, find some remote spot to camp, and spend 4 days just being teenagers, fishing, hiking, maybe sneaking some beers that Marcus's brother had bought for us. We told our parents we were going to an established campground with facilities and other people around, but really, we wanted to get as far away from civilization as possible. We wanted to prove we could handle ourselves in the wilderness. Looking back now, I can't believe our parents let us go. I mean, this was before cell phones were common. We had no way to communicate once we left town. If something had gone wrong, which it did, we would have been completely on our own. Papa's trusted us, and honestly, we were both pretty responsible kids, Eagle Scouts, good grades, never been in any real trouble. What could go wrong? We drove down on a Wednesday morning in late June. The weather was perfect, hot, but not too humid. Clear skies, no chance of rain in the forecast. We'd studied topographic maps for weeks, looking for the most remote area we could find that was still accessible by truck. We settled on this spot, deep in the forest, maybe 20 miles from the nearest town, where an old logging road supposedly led to a clearing near a creek. The drive took about 5 hours, and the last hour was on increasingly rough roads. First paved, county roads, then gravel, then this rutted dirt track that barely qualified as a road. Marcus's truck was bouncing and scraping over rocks and fallen branches, and I was getting worried we might get stuck or damage something important. But we were teenagers, so caution wasn't exactly our strong suit. We finally found the spot we'd identified on the map, a clearing about 50 yards from a creek, surrounded by thick oak and pine forest. It was perfect. It's private, peaceful, with fresh water nearby and plenty of dead wood for campfires. We set up our tents facing each other across a fire ring we built with stones from the creek bed. That first day was everything we'd hoped for. We spent the afternoon exploring the area, fishing in the creek. Didn't catch anything, but we had fun trying and just enjoying the freedom of being completely on our own. That evening, we built a campfire and cooked hot dogs and beans, feeling like we were the most independent guys in the world. As it got dark, we started hearing the usual forest sounds: owls, coyotes in the distance, insects buzzing around our heads. Nothing unusual or threatening. We stayed up late, talking about girls and our plans for the summer, feeding the fire and feeling very satisfied with ourselves for pulling off this adventure. The second day started normally too. We woke up around 8 a.m. to the sound of birds and the creek babbling nearby. We made breakfast on Marcus's camp stove and planned out our day. We wanted to do some serious hiking, okay? Maybe find some interesting rock formations or scenic overlooks we could brag about when we got home. We hiked for most of the morning, following what looked like old deer trails deeper into the forest. The woods were thick and green, full of life. We saw plenty of wildlife, squirrels, birds, even a deer that watched us for a few seconds before bounding away. It felt like we'd found this untouched wilderness that was ours alone. But around midday, things started to feel different. We were maybe 2 miles from our campsite, in an area where the trees were particularly dense and the canopy blocked out most of the sunlight. It was cooler there, which was nice given the heat, but there was something else. The forest had gotten quiet. Not completely silent, but the constant background noise of birds and insects had faded to almost nothing. Marcus noticed it first. He stopped walking and held up his hand for me to listen. "Hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" "I don't hear anything." "Exactly. Where did all the birds go?" I listened more carefully and realized he was right. Just 20 minutes earlier, the forest had been alive with sound. Now, It was like someone had turned down the volume on everything except the wind and the trees. We kept walking, but both of us were more alert now. That's when we found the first one. It was a deer, a young doe, lying on its side in a small clearing about 30 feet off the trail we were following. At first, we thought maybe it was sleeping, but as we got closer, it was obvious the animal was dead. But there was something wrong with how it looked. There was no visible injury, no blood, no sign of what had killed it. But the deer looked ... deflated somehow, like something had sucked all the moisture out of it. The hide was sunken against the ribs, and the eyes were milky white and seemed to have sunk back into the skull. "What do you think killed it?" Marcus asked, but he was whispering now, like something might be listening. I'd been hunting with my dad a few times, so I'd seen dead deer before, but nothing like this. I don't know, man. Disease, maybe. Or old age. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. This deer hadn't died of natural causes. Something had happened to it, something that had drained the life right out of it. We backed away from the carcass and continued hiking, but our mood had definitely changed. We weren't two invincible teenagers exploring the wilderness anymore. We were two kids who'd stumbled onto something they didn't understand. About a quarter-mile further on, we found another one. This time, it was a raccoon, curled up at the base of a large oak tree. Same thing, no visible wounds, but that same deflated, desiccated appearance, and the smell. Both carcasses had this sweet, sickly smell that wasn't quite like normal decomposition. But we should head back, Marcus said, and I agreed immediately. The hike back to camp felt longer than the hike out. It's probably because we were both nervous and walking faster. Every sound made us jump: a branch falling, a squirrel chattering, the wind rustling leaves. We kept expecting to find more dead animals, or worse, to encounter whatever had killed them. When we finally made it back to our campsite, we were both relieved to see our familiar orange and blue tents still standing exactly where we'd left them. The normalcy of the scene, our camp chairs, the cold ashes of last night's fire, our cooler sitting in the shade, made the dead animals seem less threatening. Maybe we'd just stumbled onto some localized disease outbreak. These things happened in nature. We spent the rest of the afternoon close to camp, fishing in the creek and trying to recapture the carefree mood of the previous day. We caught a couple small bass, which felt like a victory as evening approached. We got our fire going again and cooked the fish along with some more hot dogs. But as darkness fell, both of us were more on edge than we'd been the night before. Every sound from the forest seemed louder and more threatening. The fire, which had felt cozy and adventurous the previous evening, now felt like our only protection against whatever was lurking in the darkness around us. Around 10 p.m., we heard something that made both of us freeze. It was a sound I'd never heard before and hope I'd never hear again. It started low, almost below the range of hearing, like a deep humming or vibration, but it gradually got louder and higher in pitch until it became this otherworldly wailing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound lasted maybe 30 seconds, then faded back to nothing. We sat by the fire, staring at each other with wide eyes. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered. I didn't have an answer. It hadn't sounded like any animal I knew about. It was too organized, too deliberate to be just wind through the trees. It sounded almost like ... singing, but not human singing. Something else, trying to mimic human voices and not quite getting it right. We stayed by the fire until almost midnight, but we didn't hear the sound again. Finally, exhaustion went out, over fear, and we crawled into our respective tents. But I don't think either of us slept much. I laid in my sleeping bag, listening to every small sound, wondering if that wailing would start up again. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke up to Marcus shaking my tent. "Dude, wake up. You need to see this." Tea was just past dawn, gray light filtering through the forest. I unzipped my tent and crawled out to find Marcus standing by the remains of our campfire. Pointing at the ground around our campsite, there were tracks everywhere. Not animal tracks. These looked almost human, but wrong somehow, okay? They were the right size and shape for a person walking barefoot, but the proportions were off. Hey, the toes were too long, and there seemed to be more of them than there should be, and they were deep, pressed into the soft earth around our campsite, like whoever made them. Much heavier than they should have been. The tracks circled both of our tents multiple times. They went right up to the tent walls, so close that whatever made them could have reached out and touched the fabric. There were dozens of them, overlapping and crisscrossing like multiple somethings had been walking around our campsite for hours while we slept. "I want to go home," Marcus said, and his voice was shaking. "Right now, I want to pack up and get out of here." I couldn't agree fast enough. We broke camp in record time, throwing our gear into the truck and barely bothering to properly pack anything. We were both operating on pure adrenaline and fear at that point as we loaded the last of our stuff. I took one more look around the clearing that had seemed so perfect when we'd arrived 2 days earlier. In the morning light, with those tracks everywhere and the memory of that awful wailing sound fresh in my mind. It looked different, menacing, like the forest itself had been watching us, waiting for us to let our guard down. The drive out seemed to take forever. Every mile of rough logging road felt like it was conspiring to keep us trapped in those woods. But finally, we hit pavement, then the main highway. Then we were back in civilization with gas stations and traffic and all the normal, safe, boring things we'd been so eager to escape just a few days earlier. We'd never talked much about what happened on that camping trip. When people asked how it went, we just said it was fine, but we decided to come home early. We never went camping together again, though we stayed friends through high school and beyond. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college, that I finally did some research into what we might have encountered. I found references to similar incidents in that part of Arkansas going back decades. Hikers reporting strange sounds, dead animals drained of fluids, tracks that didn't match any known species. The local Native American tribes had stories about something they called the hungry darkness that lived in the deepest parts of the forest. Most of the reports were dismissed as hoaxes, misidentifications, but I knew what Marcus and I had experienced was real. Those tracks around our campsite weren't made by any person or animal I've ever heard of. And that sound, that terrible, otherworldly wailing, still gives me nightmares sometimes. I'm protective of my own kids now in a way that probably seems paranoid to them. When they want to go camping with friends, I insist on established campgrounds with lots of other people around. I've never told them why, and I probably never will. Some things are better left unknown, especially when you're young and think you're invincible. But I remember what it was like to be 16 and think I could handle anything the world threw at you. And I remember learning, in the most terrifying way possible, that there are things in this world that we're not equipped to handle. Things that are better left undisturbed in the deep, dark places where they belong. The cave behind the waterfall. This happened when I was 15, during what was supposed to be the best summer of my teenage years. 2003, and I was part of this youth group at our church that did outdoor adventure trips. So our youth pastor, Dave, was this cool guy in his late 20s who'd been a wilderness guide before he got into ministry. He organized these amazing trips: whitewater rafting, rock climbing, backpacking, stuff that made all the other kids in town jealous of our church group. That summer, Dave planned what he called our ultimate adventure, a 5-day backpacking trip through the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, ending at this legendary waterfall called Devil's Drop. The name should have been a warning, but when you're 15, names like that just make something sound more exciting, not more dangerous. There were 8 of us on the trip, 6 teenagers and Dave, plus 1 parent volunteer, Mr. Peterson, whose daughter Sarah was in our group. We were all experienced hikers by that point, and Dave had trained us well in wilderness safety. We knew how to read maps, purify water, set up proper camps, all that stuff. We felt pretty confident in our abilities. The first 3 days of the trip were incredible. We hiked through some of the most beautiful country I'd ever seen, with these amazing mountain views and crystal clear streams everywhere. The weather was perfect, warm during the day, cool at night, not a cloud in the sky. We were having the time of our lives. On the 4th day, we reached Devil's Drop. It was this spectacular waterfall, maybe 80 feet tall, cascading down a sheer rock face into this deep, clear pool. The mist from the falls created rainbows in the afternoon sunlight, and the whole area felt magical. We set up camp about 200 yards from the base of the falls, in a grove of hemlocks that provided perfect shade and shelter. That evening, after we'd set up camp and eaten dinner, Dave told us about the cave. He'd heard from other hikers that there was supposed to be a cave system behind the waterfall, accessible by swimming across the pool and climbing some rocks. Tita, he'd never explored it himself, but thought it might be cool to check out the next day before we started our hike out. Now, looking back as an adult, I can see all the red flags in what Dave was suggesting. Exploring an unknown cave system without proper equipment or experience is incredibly dangerous. But at 15, all I heard was secret cave behind a waterfall, and I was immediately obsessed with the idea. So were the other kids. We spent that evening planning our cave exploration. Dave said we'd need to be careful and stick together, and that we wouldn't go in very far, just far enough to see what was there. He had a couple of good waterproof flashlights, and we all had smaller lights as part of our standard gear. It seemed like a reasonable adventure for experienced hikers like ourselves. The next morning, woke up early and had breakfast. Then Dave and Mr. Peterson swam across the pool to scout out the cave entrance, while the rest of us broke down camp and packed our gear. They came back about an hour later with good news. There was indeed a cave behind the falls, and the entrance was easily accessible via some natural stone steps. It's amazing back there, Dave told us, his eyes bright with excitement. The waterfall creates this natural curtain in front of the cave mouth, and inside it opens up into this huge chamber. We didn't go very far in, but it looks like it extends pretty deep into the mountain. That was all we needed to hear. We spent the morning getting organized and waterproofing our electronics and important gear. Then, one by one, we swam across the pool to the cave entrance. Dave had been right about the approach. There were natural handholds in the rock face that made it easy to climb up behind the waterfall. And the entrance to the cave was like something out of an adventure movie. This dark opening in the rock was partially hidden by the curtain of falling water inside. The cave was even more impressive than Dave had described. The entrance chamber was huge, maybe 40 feet across and 20 feet high, with smooth stone walls and a relatively flat floor. The sound of the waterfall outside was muffled to a gentle roar, and the temperature was noticeably cooler than the summer heat outside. We spent a few minutes just taking in the sight of it, snapping pictures and marveling at this hidden world behind the waterfall. Then Dave organized us for some deeper exploration. He and Mr. Peterson would take point with the main flashlights, and the rest of us would follow in single file, staying close together. The cave extended back into the mountain in a fairly straight passage for maybe 100 feet, then branched off into multiple smaller tunnels. The main passage was wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with a ceiling high enough that even Dave, who was over 6 feet tall, didn't have to duck. About 200 feet in, we came to another large chamber, this one even bigger than the entrance. Our flashlight beams couldn't reach the far walls or the ceiling. The floor was covered with a fine white sand that crunched under our feet. And there were formations, stalactites and stalagmites that looked like they'd taken thousands of years to form. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered, and her voice echoed weirdly in the large space. "It's like our own private underground cathedral." We were all feeling pretty amazed by our discovery. It felt like the kind of adventure you see in movies. A group of teenagers finding a hidden cave system that probably hadn't been explored by many people, if any. We took lots of pictures and spent about 20 minutes just exploring the chamber. That's when Tommy, one of the other kids in our group, noticed the paintings. They were on the far wall of the chamber. It's barely visible in our flashlight beams. At first, we thought they might be natural rock formations or mineral stains, but when we got closer, it was clear they were intentional markings made by human hands. The paintings were crude, but definitely deliberate, stick figures and animals and symbols. That didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. They were done in some kind of reddish-brown pigment that had faded with age, but was still clearly visible. Some of the figures were obviously human, but others were ... different, distorted, like people, but wrong somehow. Native American cave. Paintings, Dave said with excitement. "This is an actual archaeological find. These could be hundreds or even thousands of years old." We spent another 30 minutes examining the paintings and taking pictures. Dave was documenting everything carefully, saying we'd need to report this to the proper authorities when we got back to civilization. This was turning into the adventure of a lifetime. But as we were getting ready to head back toward the cave entrance, we noticed something that made us all stop and listen. There was a sound coming from deeper in the cave system, a rhythmic tapping or clicking that echoed through the stone passages. "What is that?" Mr. Peterson asked, shining his flashlight toward the back of the chamber, where several smaller tunnels lay deeper into the mountain. We all listened carefully. The sound was definitely there. It's faint but regular. Tap, ... tap, ... tap, ... tap. Like someone tapping a stick against stone, but with a strange metallic quality to it. "It's probably just water dripping," Dave said, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Sound carries weird in caves, could be coming from anywhere. But even as he said it, the tapping seemed to be getting louder and more frequent. Instead of a steady rhythm, it was starting to sound more erratic, more urgent. "I think we should head back," Mr. Peterson said, and there was something in his voice that made all of us pay attention. He was looking toward those deeper tunnels, with an expression I've never seen on his face before. Genuine fear. Dave nodded. "Yeah, we've probably been in here long enough. Let's head back to the entrance." But as we started to gather our gear and organize for the trip out, the tapping sound suddenly stopped. The cave went completely silent except for the distant roar of the waterfall and our own breathing and footsteps. That silence was somehow worse than the mysterious tapping had been. We made our way back through the cave system toward the entrance, but something felt different. The passages that had seemed straightforward on the way in now felt confusing and maze-like. We took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in a narrow tunnel that we didn't remember exploring. "This isn't right," Dave said, studying his compass and the rough map he'd been sketching as we explored. "We should have reached the entrance chamber by now, backtracked and tried a different passage, but that led to another dead end." It was like the cave system had rearranged itself while we were looking at the paintings. "Don't panic," Dave told us, but I could see that he was starting to worry too. Caves can be disorienting. We just need to think logically and retrace our steps. But after 30 minutes of trying different passages and finding ourselves in chambers we didn't recognize, it was clear we were lost. Worse, our flashlight batteries were starting to run low. Dave had brought extra batteries, but not enough for an extended underground expedition. That's when we heard the tapping again. This time it was much closer, and it was definitely not water dripping. The sound had a deliberate quality to it, like Morse code or some kind of signal, and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, like there were several sources of the sound surrounding us in the darkness. "Stay close together," Dave ordered, and we formed a tight circle with our backs to each other. Whatever that is, we're going to find our way out of here. The tapping continued for several minutes, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, but always with that same urgent, deliberate rhythm. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped again in the silence that followed. We heard something even more disturbing. Voices, faint and distant, but definitely human voices having a conversation somewhere deeper in the cave system. "Hello?" Dave called out. "Is someone there? We're lost and need help." The voices stopped immediately. The cave went dead silent again. "Hello?" Dave called again. "Please, if someone's there, we have kids with us and we're lost." This time, there was a response, but it wasn't words. It was laughter. Multiple voices laughing together, but not in a friendly way. It was the kind of laughter you hear when someone's planning something cruel. And it was getting closer. "Cat, move," Dave said urgently. "Now, pick a tunnel and move." We chose the largest passage we could find and started walking as fast as we could, safely managed in the dim light of our failing flashlights. Behind us, the laughter continued, echoing through the cave system and seeming to come from everywhere at once. The passage we'd chosen started to slope upward, which gave us hope that we might be heading toward the surface. But after what felt like an hour of walking, though time was hard to judge in the darkness, we still hadn't found the exit. Our flashlights were getting dimmer, okay? And some of the kids were starting to panic. Sarah was crying quietly, and Tommy kept looking over his shoulder like he expected something to grab him from behind. Then, just when our situation seemed hopeless, we saw a light ahead. Not electric light, but natural daylight, filtering through what looked like a crack in the cave ceiling. There, Dave pointed toward the light source. That might be another exit. The crack was narrow, but wide enough for us to squeeze through, one at a time. Dave went first, then helped pull the rest of us up and out of the cave system. We emerged not behind the waterfall where we'd entered, but on a rocky ledge about halfway up the cliff face, maybe 200 feet from our original entry point. The climb down to ground level was tricky, but manageable for experienced hikers like ourselves. When we finally made it back to solid ground and could see our campsite in the distance, the relief was overwhelming. We'd been in the cave system for over 6 hours. The sun was starting to set, but our adventure wasn't quite over yet as we gathered our gear and prepared to hike out. To our pickup point the next day, Dave made a discovery that chilled all of us to the bone. On the ground near the base of the waterfall, partially hidden by fallen leaves, were several items that definitely hadn't been there when we'd set up camp. There were pieces of clothing, a torn shirt, a single hiking boot, a baseball cap. All of them looked like they'd been there for a while, weathered and faded. But the most disturbing item was a small notebook, its pages swollen and warped by moisture, but still partially readable. Dave opened it carefully and read the first few legible entries out loud. It was a journal kept by a hiker who'd explored the cave system several years earlier. The early entries were enthusiastic, describing the same amazing chambers and formations we'd seen. But the later entries told a different story. Asterisk, the hiker had gotten lost in the caves, just like we had. But unlike us, he hadn't found his way out quickly. The journal entries became increasingly desperate and paranoid, describing strange sounds, voices in the darkness, and the growing certainty that he was being hunted by something that lived deep in the cave system. The final entry, barely legible, was just 2 words repeated over and over. "They are coming. They're coming. They're coming." We never found out who that hiker was or what happened to him. Dave reported our discovery to the local authorities when we got back to town, but I don't think they ever conducted a serious investigation. Missing hikers are unfortunately common in wilderness areas, and the assumption is usually that they got lost or injured and succumbed to exposure. But I know what we experienced in that cave was something more than just getting lost. in a confusing tunnel system. The voices, the laughter, the way the passages seemed to shift and change, that wasn't natural. Something was in those caves with us, something that had been there long before we arrived and would be there long after we left. I'm 35 now, with teenagers of my own, and I've never told them this story. When they talk about adventure and exploration, I encourage them to stick to well-established trails and popular destinations. I know that probably makes me seem boring and overprotective, but I'd rather have them think I'm a boring dad than have them discover what we discovered behind Devil's Drop. Some adventures aren't worth having. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, and some caves should be left alone, no matter how inviting they might seem from the outside. The abandoned summer camping 38. Now, but I still have nightmares about the summer I turned 17. That was the summer my friends and I discovered what was left of Camp Wildwood, and learned that some places are abandoned for very good reasons. It was 2002, and I was part of this tight group of friends who'd grown up together in a small town in upstate New York. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Lisa, and twins Matt and Mike, who lived next door to me. We'd all been friends since elementary school, and we thought we were pretty mature and worldly as high school seniors. That summer, we're all working part-time jobs and saving money for college. We still wanted to have one last big adventure before we graduated and went our separate ways. We'd heard rumors for years about this abandoned summer camp somewhere in the Adirondack State Park, about an hour's drive from our town. The story, as we'd heard it, was that Camp Wildwood had been a popular kids' summer camp back in the 1970s and early 80s. But something had happened. Accounts varied depending on who was telling the story, and the camp had been suddenly shut down and abandoned. Some people said there had been an accident. Others claimed it was a scandal involving the camp director. A few of the more dramatic versions involved a camper disappearing or even being murdered. Whatever the truth was, the camp had been closed for almost 20 years by the time we decided to find it. The state had apparently just left everything there to rot rather than spending money to demolish it properly. Over the years, it had become this legendary destination for teenagers looking for a spooky adventure. The problem was that nobody seemed to know exactly where it was located. The stories we'd heard were all vague, somewhere off Route 30 or near Cranberry Lake, but nothing specific enough to actually find the place. This was before GPS was common and before you could just Google Abandoned Summer Camp New York and get detailed directions. But Jake's older brother Tony had graduated a few years ahead of us, and he claimed he and his friends had found the camp during their senior year. Tony was known for exaggerating stories, so we took what he told us with a grain of salt. But he gave us enough details: a specific exit off the highway, a dirt road marked with a particular milepost, a rusted gate with a faded sign, that we thought we might be able to find it. We planned a trip for a long weekend in August. My parents thought we were going to spend 2 nights camping at a regular state park campground, which was technically true. We did plan to camp, just not at an official campground, and we did plan to stay in a state park, just not in the part that was open to the public. We loaded up Jake's dad's SUV with camping gear, food for 3 days, and enough batteries and flashlights to explore a cave system. We also bought a camera to document our adventure and prove to everyone back home that we'd actually found the legendary Camp Wildwood. The drive took about 2 hours. Following Tony's directions through increasingly remote rural areas, we found the exit he described, then the dirt road marked with the milepost 23. The road was overgrown, but still passable, winding through dense forest for maybe 3 miles before we came to what had to be the entrance Tony had told us about. There was, indeed, a rusted metal gate, chained shut, but with a gap wide enough for people to squeeze through. And there was a sign, faded and weather-beaten, that we could barely make out the words Camp Wildwood a summer adventure since 1972. We parked the SUV as far off the road as we could manage and hiked through the gate. The camp's access road was in terrible shape, cracked and overgrown with weeds, but we could still follow it as it wound through the forest. About half a mile in, we got our first glimpse of the camp itself. It was both exactly what we'd expected and somehow more unsettling than we'd imagined. There were maybe a dozen buildings scattered around a central area that had probably once been a nice grassy commons. But after 20 years of abandonment, everything was falling apart. The main lodge was a large wooden building with a sagging roof and broken windows. Several smaller cabins were arranged in a rough circle around the commons, all in various states of decay. There was an old dining hall with its doors hanging open on broken hinges, and what looked like an arts and crafts building with its roof partially caved in. But the most eerie part was how much stuff was still there. It was like the camp had been abandoned suddenly, with everyone just walking away and leaving everything behind. Through the broken windows, we could see tables and chairs still arranged as if waiting for campers to return. There were old camp signs still hanging crooked on posts. A rusty swing set sat in what had probably been a playground area. "This is incredible," Lisa whispered as we stood at the edge of the commons, taking it all in. It's like a ghost town, but for kids. We spent the first hour just walking around and exploring the exterior of the buildings. Everything was weathered and rotting, but the basic structures were still intact. Jake was taking pictures of everything, documenting our discovery. As the sun started to get lower in the sky, we decided to set up our campsite. We found a relatively clear area near what had been a volleyball court. Far enough from the buildings to feel safe, but close enough to explore them after dark with our flashlights. That evening, we built a campfire and cooked hot dogs for dinner, feeling pretty pleased with ourselves for successfully finding this legendary place. As darkness fell, we got our flashlights ready and decided to do some serious exploration of the buildings. We started with the main lodge. The front door was locked, but one of the windows was broken out completely, making it easy to climb inside. The interior was a mess, furniture covered with years of dust and debris, animal droppings everywhere, and a musty smell that made us all want to breathe through our mouths. Asterisk, but it was fascinating too. The walls were covered with faded camp, photos and motivational posters from the 1970s and early 80s. There was still a stone fireplace with the camp Wildwood logo carved into the mantel, and on one wall was a large wooden plaque listing the names of campers and counselors by year, going all the way back to 1972. "Look at this," Matt called from behind what had been the front desk. He'd found a logbook that had somehow survived the decades of abandonment. The pages were yellowed and warped, but still readable. The logbook contained daily entries from the camp director, chronicling the normal activities of a summer camp: swimming lessons, nature hikes, arts and crafts, projects, evening campfires. Reading through it was like getting a glimpse into this lost world of childhood summers. But as we read further into the book, the entries started to change in tone. The camp director began mentioning problems: campers getting lost during hikes, equipment mysteriously breaking or disappearing, staff members quitting suddenly without explanation. The final entries, in late July 1983, were increasingly worried and confused. The director wrote about campers waking up screaming from nightmares, about strange sounds coming from the forest at night, about a growing sense that something was watching the camp from the darkness beyond the tree line. The last entry in the book was dated July 28, 1983. It was just 2 sentences. 3 more children missing this morning. We're evacuating everyone today. Holy shit, Jake whispered as he read the final entry out loud. This is why the camp was shut down. Kids actually went missing. Okay, asterisk, we were all quiet for a moment, processing what we'd just learned. The campfire stories about Camp Wildwood hadn't been exaggerated after all. Something really had happened here. something serious enough to shut down the entire operation overnight. Maybe we should head back, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay. The afternoon light, filtering through the dusty windows, suddenly seemed dimmer. The silence of the abandoned building felt heavier, but Matt was already flipping through more pages, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "Wait, look at this," he said, pointing to some loose papers tucked into the back of the logbook. "There are newspaper clippings here." The yellowed newspaper articles told a partial story. "Summer camp closes after missing children incident," read. One headline from the local paper stated August 2nd, 1983. The article was frustratingly vague, Kay mentioning only that 3 minors went missing during a supervised hiking activity, and that the camp had voluntarily ceased operations pending investigation. Another clipping from a few weeks later reported that the missing children had been found safe, though it offered no details about where they'd been or what had happened to them. The final article, from September, simply stated that Camp Wildwood would not be reopening and that the property had been put up for sale. "Found safe," Jake repeated, reading over Matt's shoulder. But no details about where or how. "That's weird, right?" "Everything about this is weird," I said, glancing around the reception area with new eyes. It's a carved logo on the fireplace mantel, which had seemed charming moments before, now felt somehow ominous. The list of names on the wooden plaque made me wonder which ones had been there that final, terrible summer that Emma had wandered over to the windows facing the lake. "Guys," she called out, her voice tight with something between excitement and fear. "You need to see this." We gathered around her at the window. Down by the water's edge, barely visible through the overgrown brush and fallen logs, could make out the remains of what had once been a dock, but it wasn't the rotting wooden structure that had caught Emma's attention. There, scratched into the bark of a large oak tree near the water, were what looked like symbols or markings. They were too far away to make out clearly, but they appeared deliberate, purposeful, and fresh. "Those weren't made in 1983, Emma said quietly. "That bark would have grown over by now, or the tree would have fallen. Someone carved those recently." The implication hung in the air between us. We weren't the first people to find this place. Someone else had been here, and recently enough to leave marks that were still visible. "Okay," Sarah said, backing away from the window. "Now, I really think we should go." But as we turned to leave, we heard it, a sound that made us all freeze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps on gravel coming from somewhere outside the building. The summer at Crow's Hollow, the old photograph sits on Dr. Rebecca Palmer's desk even now, 30 years later, showing 6 teenagers standing in front of a weathered camp sign. And if you look closely, really closely, you can see the 7th figure hovering just behind them, transparent as morning mist, but undeniably there. Rebecca, now a respected psychiatrist specializing in adolescent trauma, often found herself staring at that photo during quiet moments between patients, remembering the summer of 1994 when she learned that some friendships transcend death and some promises bind tighter than blood. She had been 15 that summer, all gangly limbs and frizzy hair, desperate to reinvent herself before starting sophomore year at Westbridge High. Camp Crow's Hollow would change your life, the brochure had promised, showing smiling teenagers around campfires, canoeing on the lake, and learning leadership skills that last a lifetime. Her parents, worried about her introversion and recent anxiety attacks, had practically pushed her onto the bus that humid June morning. "You'll make friends," her mother had said, smoothing Rebecca's unruly curls one last time. "You'll see. Sometimes we just need to step outside our comfort zone." If only her mother had known how far outside that zone Rebecca would travel. The bus ride to Camp Crow's Hollow took 4 hours, winding through increasingly dense forests until civilization seemed like a distant memory. Rebecca pressed her face against the window, watching the trees grow thicker and darker, trying to ignore the flutter of panic in her chest. She'd never been away from home for 6 weeks before, never been good at making friends, never been comfortable in her own skin, let alone around others. "First time?" Voice asked, and Rebecca turned to find a girl with short blonde hair and knowing green eyes sitting across the aisle. "How could you tell?" Rebecca asked, managing a weak smile. The girl laughed, not unkindly. "You've got that look like you're heading to prison instead of camp. I'm Ashley, 3rd summer here. Trust me, it gets easier." She leaned closer, conspiratorial. "Want to know a secret? Everyone's terrified their first day, even the counselors, especially the counselors, by the time they reached Camp Crow's Hollow." Ashley had adopted Rebecca, chattering about camp traditions, which counselors were cool, as activities to avoid unless you enjoyed mosquito bites in unfortunate places. The camp itself was exactly as advertised: rustic cabins arranged around a central lodge, a pristine lake reflecting the afternoon sun, and forest trails disappearing into green shadows. It would have been idyllic if not for the persistent feeling that something was watching from those shadows, waiting. "Cabin 7, announced Dave, the impossibly cheerful head counselor who looked like he'd stepped out of the camp brochure. "Rebecca Palmer, Ashley Chin, Madison Brooks, Jennifer Martinez, and Samantha Wright. You ladies are in for an amazing summer." Cabin 7 sat at the edge of the camp, closest to the forest, and Rebecca noticed the other cabins seemed to give it a wide berth, like planets avoiding a black hole's gravity. Inside, 5 beds were arranged military style, with the 6th bed pushed against the far wall, its mattress stripped bare. "No one sleeps there," Ashley said quickly when she saw Rebecca looking. "Camp tradition. Every cabin keeps 1 bed empty." "Why?" Rebecca asked. There was something in Ashley's expression made her not really want to know. "Just tradition," Madison said, tossing her designer luggage onto a middle bed. She was the kind of pretty that made Rebecca feel even more awkward perfect. Teeth, perfect hair, perfectly bored expression. Probably some stupid ghost story to scare the newbies. But that night, after lights out, when the moon cast silver squares through the windows, Ashley told them the real reason. Her name was Lisa Holloway, Ashley whispered, and the other. Girls gathered on her bed, drawn by the irresistible pull of a ghost story. Summer of 1978. She was in cabin 7, just like us. Sweet girl, everyone said. Quiet, kind of a loner, but nice. She'd write in her journal every night while the other girls gossiped. The wind picked up outside, making the windows rattle, and Rebecca pulled her knees to her chest. "What happened to her?" Jennifer asked, her usual skepticism wavering in the dark. Ashley's voice dropped even lower. "No one knows for sure. One morning, her bed was empty. They searched everywhere at the lake, the forest, even dredged the old well behind the kitchen. Nothing, but her journal was still there, under her pillow. The last entry just said, 'They don't see me anymore.' That's it." Madison scoffed, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "That's not scary. That's just sad. It's not the scary part," Ashley continued. "Every summer since, weird things happen in cabin 7. Girls say they hear someone crying at night. Things move around. Hey, and sometimes," she paused dramatically, "sometimes a 6th girl shows up in group photos, someone who was never there." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "You're making that up?" Ashley shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe you'll see for yourself. Lisa's bed is empty for a reason. She's still using it." They eventually drifted back to their own beds, laughing nervously, pretending they didn't believe a word. But Rebecca lay awake long after the others' breathing had deepened into sleep, staring at that empty 6th bed. Was it her imagination, or did the moonlight there seem different, softer, as if filtered through something unseen? The first week passed in a blur of activity swimming lessons where Rebecca discovered she was surprisingly good at the butterfly stroke, failed attempts at archery, sing-alongs around the campfire where she mostly mouthed the words. She was starting to relax, to believe her mother might have been right about stepping outside her comfort zone. Her Capil mates were becoming real friends. Even Madison's mean girl exterior hid deep insecurities about living up to her older sister's achievements. It was Thursday night of the second week when everything changed. Rebecca woke to the sound of crying soft, muffled, but unmistakably real, as she lay still, heart pounding, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from the empty bed. "Ashley," she whispered, but her friend was dead asleep. The crying continued, and beneath it, Rebecca heard something else, the scratch of pencil on paper. Unable to stand it anymore, she sat up and looked directly at Lisa's bed. A girl sat there, translucent in the moonlight, writing in a journal. She looked about 15, with long, dark hair and a camp t-shirt from a different era. As Rebecca watched, frozen, the girl looked up and their eyes met. "You can see me," the girlie says, her voice like wind through leaves. "I knew you would. You're like me, aren't you? On the edges, never quite fitting in." Rebecca should have screamed, should have woken the others, but instead she found herself nodding. "Sometimes I feel invisible too," she admitted. Lisa's transparent face crumpled. "I didn't mean to become actually invisible. I just wanted them to notice me, to really see me. I found this old book in the forest, did a ritual. I thought it would make me more interesting, more visible. Instead, ... She gestured at her see-through form. Opposite happened. Slowly at first, people would look through me, forget I was there. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. One morning, I simply wasn't anymore. Not dead, not alive, just ... not. That's horrible," Rebecca breathed. "But why can I see you?" Lisa tilted her head, studying Rebecca with eyes that held decades of loneliness. "Because you understand, because you're afraid of the same thing, of disappearing, of never being seen. The ritual feeds on that fear. And now that you can see me, ... double quotes, her form flickered, starting to notice you too." Over the following nights, Rebecca and Lisa talked in whispers while the others slept. Lisa told her about the summer of '78, about feeling overshadowed by prettier, more outgoing girls, about the book she'd found hidden in a hollow tree, rituals of revelation and concealment written in spidery handwriting. She'd only wanted to be noticed, to be special. Instead, she'd been erased. Is there a way to reverse it? Rebecca asked on the fourth night of their strange friendship. Lisa's expression brightened with hope. "I've had 30 years to think about it. The ritual required a sacrifice of visibility, gave up being seen to become worth seeing. A horrible irony. To reverse it, I think someone would have to truly see me, all of me, and choose to make me visible again. But it's dangerous. The thing that took my visibility, it's still hungry. It might take yours too." Rebecca thought about her own fears, her own feelings of invisibility. But she also thought about Lisa, trapped for decades in this half-existence, and knew what she had to do. "Tell me what you need." The ritual, as Lisa explained it, was surprisingly simple. On the night of the new moon, which was, coincidentally, that very night, Rebecca would need to gather the others. Tell them Lisa's story. Make them see her not as a ghost story, but as a real girl who'd been lost. Then, using water from the lake under starlight and words from the original ritual spoken backward, they might be able to pull Lisa back into the visible world. But if it fails, Lisa warned, you might disappear too. The thing that feeds on invisibility, it's always watching for new victims. Why risk it? Rebecca looked at this girl who could have been her, lonely, desperate to belong, making a terrible mistake out of pain. Because everyone deserves to be seen, she said simply. Convincing the others was harder than the ritual itself. You want us to what? Madison said, sitting up in bed as Rebecca finished explaining. Perform some weird ritual to make a ghost visible. Becky, honey, I think the camp food is getting to you. Her name is Rebecca, not Becky, a voice said, and everyone froze. Lisa stood by her bed, flickering but visible to all of them now, driven into manifestation by Rebecca's determination. And yes, I'm real as a girl who hasn't been seen for 30 years can be. Jennifer grabbed Samantha's hand. Ashley's mouth hung open. Madison, for once, was speechless. Please, Lisa said, her voice stronger now that she had an audience. I made a stupid mistake when I was your age. I let my fear of being nobody turn me into nothing. Rebecca's willing to risk everything to help me. All I'm asking is for you to see me, really see me, for one night. It was Ashley who stood first. I've been coming here for 3 years, hearing your story, using you to scare new campers. But I never thought. I'm sorry. Tell us what to do. One by one, the others agreed. Even Madison, though she muttered about group hallucinations and contaminated bug spray, they snuck out after midnight, 5 teenage girls in pajamas following, a ghost to the lake. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they passed, and Rebecca could feel something watching, waiting, hungry for whatever would happen next. At the lake's edge, under a sky brilliant with stars, but no moon, they formed a circle. Lisa stood in the center, more solid than Rebecca had ever seen her, but still translucent, like a reflection on disturbed water. The original words were about hiding, about becoming less to be more, Lisa explained. We need to reverse them, speak them backward, while truly seeing each other. It's not just looking, but seeing. Rebecca took the lead, speaking the strange words Lisa had taught her, the other girls repeating them. As they chanted, the lake began to glow with a soft phosphorescence. The watching presence pressed closer, and Rebecca felt a tugging sensation, as if something was trying to pull her out of her own skin. It's fighting back, Lisa gasped. Kid doesn't want to let me go. It's trying to take one of you instead. Rebecca felt herself starting to fade, her hands becoming translucent. The other girls gasped, their chant faltering. No, Madison suddenly shouted, you don't get to take her. You want someone who feels invisible? Fine. Let me tell you about invisible. And to everyone's shock, the perfect, popular Madison began to speak about living in her sister's shadow, about the eating disorder. No one noticed, about crying in bathroom stalls, while everyone thought she had it all together. We're all invisible sometimes, Jennifer added, talking about being the only Latina girl in her honors classes, how teachers always seemed surprised when she excelled. Samantha spoke of hiding her poverty, pretending her thrift store clothes were vintage by choice. Ashley admitted that her constant chatter was armor against a fear that if she stopped talking, she'd disappear entirely. As each girl spoke their truth, Rebecca felt herself solidifying. Okay, the hungry presence recoiled, overwhelmed by the raw honesty, the mutual seeing. And in the center of their circle, Lisa began to glow not with ghostly light, but with the warm radiance of humanity returning. It's working, Rebecca breathed. Keep going. See her. See each other. See yourselves. The ritual reached a crescendo, 5 voices speaking as one, acknowledging pain and fear and the terrible desire to be known. The lake water at their feet began to bubble and steam. The watching presence let out a shriek like tearing metal and fled, leaving only the natural sounds of the night. When the waters calmed, Lisa Holloway stood before them solid, breathing. She was 15 years old, despite the 30 years that had passed. She looked down at her hands in wonder, then burst into tears. Okay, wet tears that left tracks on cheeks that could finally be touched. I'm back, she sobbed. I'm really back. The girls collapsed together in a group hug, laughing and crying and marveling at what they'd done. They'd faced down something ancient and hungry, armed only with honesty and friendship, stayed made. The invisible, visible, through the simple act of truly seeing. Getting Lisa integrated back into the world proved challenging, but not impossible. The camp administration, faced with the girl who matched photographs from 1978 but hadn't aged today, chose to believe the cover story the girls concocted about Lisa being a runaway who'd been living in the woods. Traumatized into believing she was a ghost, her family, miraculously still alive, welcomed her back with tears and questions that Lisa deflected with partial truths. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of ordinary camp activities, made extraordinary by their shared secret. The six of them were inseparable, bonded by an experience none of them could fully explain, but all of them understood. Lisa struggled sometimes, overwhelmed by how much the world had changed, but her newfound friends helped her navigate everything from the internet to boy bands. On the last night of camp, they snuck out one final time to the lake. No ritual this time, just six girls sitting on the shore, watching the stars. "Thank you," Lisa said for the 100th time. "All of you, but especially you, Rebecca. You saw me when no one else could." Rebecca smiled, feeling more visible herself than she ever had before. "We all saw each other. That's what made it work." They took a photo there by the lake, six girls, with their arms around each other, faces glowing with genuine joy. It wasn't until the photos were developed weeks later that they noticed the seventh figure's shadow hovering protectively behind him, formless, but somehow benevolent, as if the thing that had fed on invisibility had been transformed into something else. Something that protected the bonds between those who truly saw each other. Becca kept in touch with all of them over the years. Ashley became a teacher, using her gift of gab to reach shy students. Madison went into social work, helping other girls with the struggles she'd hidden so well. Jennifer became a doctor. Samantha, a successful entrepreneur. Lisa, given a second chance at life, became a therapist specializing in teen isolation and depression. And Rebecca herself, shaped by that summer when she learned the power of being seen and seeing others, dedicated her career to helping young people find their voices and their visibility. The photograph on her desk served as a daily reminder that sometimes the most powerful magic wasn't in ancient rituals or hungry spirits, but in the simple act of recognition, of saying to another human being, "I see you, you matter, you're not alone." Her patients, struggling with their own invisibility, often asked about the photo, and Rebecca would tell them in terms they could accept. About a summer when six girls faced their fears together, and discovered that the antidote to disappearing wasn't being perfect or popular or special, it was being real, being seen, being connected. The full truth lived in her memory and in the memories of 5 women scattered across the country, but forever linked by that night at the lake when they pulled a lost girl back from the void and, in doing so, found themselves. Camp Crow's Hollow still operates, though Cabin 7 was eventually torn down and rebuilt. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is new and the lake is still, counselors report seeing lights on the water, not the cold, hungry glow of something seeking prey, but warm, golden lights like a circle of lanterns, as if the lake remembers the night when love proved stronger than fear, when friendship broke an ancient hunger, when 6 teenage girls discovered that the truest magic was in seeing and being seen, and in her office, treating a new generation of invisible teenagers. Dr. Rebecca Palmer holds on to that truth like a lifeline, passing it on one patient at a time. You are seen. You matter. You are never as alone as you think. The summer at Crow's Hollow had ended 30 years ago, but its lessons lived on in every life touched by the 6 women who'd learned that summer that visibility wasn't about being noticed, it was about being known, being understood, being part of something bigger than yourself. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, Rebecca could still hear Lisa's voice on the wind. "Thank you for seeing me." To which she always whispered back, "Thank you for teaching me how to see."